The list of the Kinos that we're saying should be available in the back of the shul. Can women upstairs hear me clearly? That's a yes? Women downstairs by the Mechita? Yeah? Okay. Just before we begin, I want to thank the sponsors for today's Kinos. Bobby Zimmer Khan, in memory of her late husband, Ben Zimmer, Zichrono Livracha, commemorating his 20th yahrzeit, the Neshama Shevan Aliyah, by my mother, Mrs. Eileen Yalkut, in memory of her father, my grandfather, Avram Yecheskel Ben Tzviris Halevi Schlesinger, on the occasion of his 27th yahrzeit 2 weeks from today, and by our friends Frank Lieberman and Beverly Barkan, Lili Nishmas, Claire Roy. Again, all of the neshamos should have aliyos. I just want to thank, before we begin, Tzvi Friedman and Miriam Kaminsky, who have been involved on the back end, making sure that we would be able, particularly to share this experience with those of you who are watching virtually. It's not always as simple as it seems, that down to the wires going out the window down to the first floor. So again, we thank them very much for being able to make this into a reality. And again, I want to thank my wife Anna, and in general to my family. My immersion in Tisha B'Av for weeks before Tisha B'Av, I imagine does not always make me the best company. One of my kids made a very cynical comment when she saw what I was packing, as it were, for beach reading on vacation. Not exactly the most uplifting material. So again, I do not take what they do for granted, and hope that again that they can take chizuk, that the sacrifices that they make on an ongoing basis on the Toas and Tzibur, for the good of our community today, both our community, Asher Yeshno Imanu Hayom, who are sitting with us today in Shul, Asher Yinenu Po Imanu Hayom, and those who are across the world who are learning and mourning together with us. Finally, every year, I thank not my Rebbe, but the Rebbe of all my Rebbeim, with Yosher Ber Salvation, St. Chazadik, Rebbe Bracha. The Rebbe was the pioneer of turning Tisha B'Av into a day that we connect to through learning. And again, there is a Rebbe of mine once remarked ironically that even though, technically speaking, Torah study is usher on Tisha B'Av, you're not allowed to learn Torah on Tisha B'Av except for material that is directly relevant to the themes of the day itself. But ironically, Tisha B'Av is probably the day of most learning all summer, if not all year, for many people, and that is directly due to the years where our Salvation would share from his Torah in Boston until his onset. And again, that underlying everything I do is the Rebbe's Torah on Tisha B'Av, and particularly through my Rebbe, Rabbi J.P. Schachter, who again has really brought this to the communal attention of the entire Jewish world, and has been both the chronicler of the Rebbe's Torah. He wrote the Lord is righteous in all his ways, which if you want to read all of the Rebbe's Torah in one place on Tisha B'Av, that is the place to start. But again, for many, many years, I've been sharing this. I've never actually been with him on Tisha B'Av, but again, that directly and indirectly, I credit Rabbi Schachter as well with what we are going to do today. Again, just a note for those of you who have not been with us in the past, that we will basically go until Mincha time. Mincha is at 2 o'clock. Again, I understand that not everyone has the entire morning to be involved. I feel the Sassoon standing up as soon as I said till 2 o'clock. That's not a bad sign, but just a reminder that that's going to be the program. That is not mechayev you. It doesn't obligate you to be here for the entire time. It continues to be broadcast. So again, I like having the live audience with us. That adds to our experience. But again, if you need to leave, that's perfectly understandable, and people shouldn't feel uncomfortable, getting up if that's what they need to do. The story of Tisha B'Av begins in Babylonia, some 2,500 years ago. And we don't know a lot about what those early Tisha B'Avs were like. In fact, the only reason that we know about that Tisha B'Av that was observed by the exilic community in Babylonia is because we have in the book of Zechariah one of the first recorded shilas in Jewish history. So this is a nevuah that takes us back to the time of the very, very beginning of the Second Temple, which again was a bit of a fitful exercise. There was not a mass return of Jews to Eretz Yisrael at that time. There still continued to be a robust community in Bavel, and again, that community, to a large degree, continues for 3,000 years, one of the oldest Jewish communities in the entire world, until they were largely expelled from Iraq after the establishment of the State of Israel in the late 1940s. So the Babylonian Jewish community sends a shaila to Yerushalayim, right? They ask Al Kohanim Asher L'Beis Hashem Tzvakos, to the Kohanim who were in the Beis Hamikdash, the El Hanavim, and to the prophets. And they asked, Ha'evke b'chodesh ha'chamishi hi nazer ka'asher asisi zeh kama yomim. And they said, shall I weep during the 5th month? Shall I afflict myself as I have for all these years? So from the question, we understand that there was an institution of fasting in the 5th month. Right? We don't know with certainty what day they fasted. But again, the Psukim talk about the Beis Hamikdash, the first Beis Hamikdash being destroyed, depending where you look, either on the 7th or the 10th. And we don't know what the day, of the earliest iteration of Tisha B'Av was observed on. In fact, the Kinos suggests that the original fasts were only instituted for the month. Right? Again, the way that the Navi continues to report on these fast days, the whole cycle of fast days comes from that period. And the Navi calls them the fast of the 5th month, the fast of the 7th month, the fast of the 10th month. So the Minchas Chinuch says, why does he call them that? Because the initial gezerah, right, the initial enactment of the fast days was not on specific dates, but the Minchas Chinuch suggests it was on months. It's not really his original idea, it's based on a ritva. Right, but the idea is, he says, that's why they were called the fast of the 5th month. Right, perhaps it was up to communities or even individuals to schedule when they were going to fast during that month. Why they did it that way, that's a shiur for another time. So they send whatever it was, telegrams, emails, WhatsApps to the Beis Hamikdash. Shall we continue to observe these fast days? Are they still relevant if the Beis Hamikdash is literally being rebuilt? The prophet Zechariah responds to them. And the prophet Zechariah doesn't directly answer them, but he basically says the essence is not the fast day, but the avoda of the fast day. Right? Are you really repairing all of the sins that caused the destruction? But he gives them an enigmatic prophecy, a prophecy of comfort that one day all of these fast days will become days of rejoicing. That's what we have in Sefer Zechariah. So part of the reason that I came back to this year is that right after that answer, we're given one other nevuah, beautiful nevuah. Zechariah tells the Jews that one day, old men and small children will be restored to the streets of Yerushalayim. Old men, old women, they'll be there sitting on the benches, holding their sticks, and the streets will be filled once again with children playing. So this pasuk was on my mind because I came across an old email that I wrote a couple of years ago. Everybody, I think, remembers Tzoi Simchas Torah 3 years ago. What it was like after 2 days of rumors to finally be flooded with information that as bad as we thought it was that much worse. And that was the night that I discovered that a young man I remembered as a small child in my shul in Richmond, Virginia, Hirsch Goldberg, Poland, had been taken captive, was missing. That's all we knew that night. I didn't reach out yet to his parents, who were my balbatim, John and Rachel. I figured they were bombarded. They didn't need me that night. But I went back through my email to look at old emails. So I found an email that Rachel, before the whole world knew her, Rachel had sent me in 2008, 2009. It was before Yantif. They just made Aliyah. And she said, I know it's your busy season, sorry to bother you. Can you tell me where that pasuk is that talks about the old people and the children playing in the streets of Yerushalayim? So it's very nice about it. I didn't just send her a link to Google. I told her it's a pasuk in Zechariah, Perek Chas. So I had forgotten about that email until then. And frankly, that week I had forwarded that email to a mutual friend of ours from those Virginia days, saying, reading this now makes me shiver. Asking, where is that nevuah? The children will play in the streets of Yerushalayim. And I said then that I hope that she sees a kiyum, a fulfillment of that nevuah. So Nebuch, we all know now that it wasn't meant to be. And I hope that they and all the bereaved parents will merit to grow old in the streets of Yerushalayim, and to see Einiklach playing in the streets, even before Tchias HaMesim. So that's the prophecy of Zechariah. And if you recall, we'll come back to it. Rabbi Akiva said, well-known Gemara at the end of Makos, that after he saw the prophecy, the Temple Mount would be plowed over like a field, he had renewed faith that this prophecy would be fulfilled as well. And often on Tisha B'Av, I feel like we need Rabbi Akiva at our sides, pulling us from the despair, which is so common. So I don't know what Tisha B'Av looked like in Bavel 2,500 years ago. But if I had to guess, what was proto-Kinos? Before there was a Kinos book, before there was Kinos presentations, what do our ancestors in Bavel say in Tisha B'Av? So I have to guess that one of the first Kinos is Tehillim, chapter 137, Kuflan Zayin, Al Neros Bavel. This is perhaps in the running to be the biblical anthem of Churban. So I'm sure you remember the words, Al Neros Bavel, on the rivers of Babylon. Sham Yoshavnu, Gam Bechinu, B'Zachrenu Es Tzion. There we sat and we wept when we remembered Tzion. On the willows we hung our harps. Shiru Lanu Mishir Tzion. They said to us, sing to us those famous songs of Zion, the beautiful songs. And they said, Eichna Shira Hashem El Admas Nechar. How can we sing the beautiful songs we remember the Beis Hamikdash on foreign soil? How is it possible in Mishkachei Yerushalayim Tishkachim Imi? I swear, if I forget Yerushalayim, I'll forget my right hand. I'm like, Ales Yerushalayim Al Rosim Chasi. If I don't elevate, hold Yerushalayim, hold the Beis Hamikdash, hold Shever Basami, the shattering of my nation, above my greatest joy. So I have now been teaching on Tisha B'Av for more than a quarter century. I don't know how many times I've come back to Al Neros Bavel, but I saw something new. A Malbim that reads Al Neros Bavel differently than I have until now. I used to always read Al Neros Bavel as being about Jews in abject suffering. I imagine these are the words that Jews being marched in chains from Eretz Yisrael, from Yerushalayim, slaves, hopeless, broken, shattered people, that nothing could stir them, filled with no hope, no joy, nothing left in the world. Like the worst shiva you've ever been at in your life. But the Malbim reads differently. You know, it's striking. These are people who can talk about Rosh Simchasi, of elevating Yerushalayim above my greatest joy. We see from there, Zetan V'Dah, that Simcha was not something completely elusive to these Jews. This was not necessarily the throes of grief. Says the Malbim, Lo haya ba'avur she'avadnu atovos hagashmios me'osher va'kinyonim sados uchramim. It wasn't about our material losses, the fields, the vineyards, the streams, because very quickly we had those things in Bavel. Remember, he says, the prophet Yirmiyahu told the Jews, Banu batim v'shavu nitukramim v'ichlu espirion. Yirmiyahu told the Jews in Bavel, build houses and sit there, dwell there. plant vineyards, drink the fruit. Alner's Bavel is not the song, says the Malbim, of skeletons liberated from Bergen-Belsen. These are survivors that already started to make it. Sham Yoshavnu. That's where we lived. That's where we settled. Riverfront property. And the rivers of Babylon with the swaying palm trees wasn't so bad. And that, by the way, is why when Koresh, the king of Persia, told the Jews, you can go home, you can build the Beis HaMikdash, the doors are open. Most of the Jews stayed in Bavel. Because once in Yirmiyahu's storied career, they listened to him. They built houses. Then they redid the houses. Then they offered their neighbors cash to buy their house, and they knocked it down and built a house twice the size. It was good in Bavel. Al naros Bavel, gam yosham yoshavnu, gam bachinu. The struggle of Bavel, says the Malbim, was how to live the good life on the one hand and still remember Sion. So I never thought about it like that. Taka possible. So the truth is, I wish I saw this Malbim like in 1998. It would have been, as I think about how I framed Kinos, the perfect framing for Kinos, for Jews in the golden age of American Jews. We're on the rise, we're ascending, things are good and things are sweet. And it's the middle of the summer. We're on vacation. And Taka, that's what I used to talk about the first years every year, is how do we make Tisha B'Av relevant when it doesn't feel relevant? My grandparents were in concentration camps. My parents grew up going to day schools in America, making it here. My in-laws grew up as small children under Stalin. My father-in-law was arrested on a Simchas Torah night in Leningrad. But by the time I got married, they'd been living in America for decades. Chasdei Hashem had been successful, raised a family. So I needed to look at Al Naras Bavel, the message I had to give when I was talking to Jews in West Orange, New Jersey, in Wild Rose, Wisconsin, in Teaneck, in Virginia. That was the challenge. How to remember, how to make it relevant. Imlei Ales Yerushalayim Arosh Simchasi. Our simchas were so high. And of course, the elephant in the room, Yerushalayim. Today we can go to Yerushalayim. Children play in the streets. Old men, old women. And there are Jews today who daven, who say Shemona Esrei, who are mishtachave, who prostrate themselves in prayer on the Har HaVayis itself, on the Temple Mount. So ha'evke b'chodesh ha'chamishi. Like the Jews in Bavel, do we cry in the 5th month? Doesn't feel like that anymore. Baruch Hashem, in many ways, we still continue to be successful, to be prosperous. There's a parody going around yesterday of an ash board for sale for Tisha B'Av. Different kinds of designer ash to use for your Suda Mafsekes. And it was a parody of the prevalence in the firm world today in America of meat boards. Something, again, our ancestors would never have understood. Even our younger selves wouldn't have understood. And frankly, perhaps as out-of-towners, we don't really understand. The idea for a few $100s you can have a piece of wood with different kinds of exotic, expensive, dried pieces of meat on it. It's interesting, this discussion halacha about whether or not old meat, dried meat, is part of the restrictions of the 9 days or not. And I imagine if the Rishonim Achronim discussed this, walked into a supermarket in Teaneck, in Lakewood, in Muncie today, the 5 towns, what they would have made of old meat. But fine. So it's a joke. But it doesn't feel so distant anymore. It doesn't feel so distant. The Malbim Taka have been good for many years. But I don't think we need him anymore this year. So Tisha B'Av really, and the Kinos particularly, are about memory rather than history. History needs fixed times, dates. You navigate things on a timeline. You need specificity. You need details. You need facts. You look at trends. Memory is much more elusive. We all know memory isn't so accurate. But memory is important. Memory frames how we feel about things, how things motivate us, how things impact us in ways that we're not always aware of. So on Tisha B'Av, everything blends together. And that was the shita, the approach of the Bali Kinos, of the authors of the Kinos, of the Bali Medrash, that we weave back and forth in time. And if someone is hung up on dates when they're reading the Kinos, they get very confused. Suddenly, in particular, the author of the earliest Kinos, the Kalir, jumps back and forth, first Beis HaMikdash, second Beis HaMikdash, events that take place in Tanakh, events that take place perhaps in his own time. They'll occupy a single line in the Kinos. And that's because the point is to impact us. So I want to go back, at least for now, to the beginning, to the destruction of the first temple. So the first Kina, Shavas Suru, from a literary perspective, very complex. Right? He takes psukim from every parak and eicha. Right? Again, the artistry, if you're into this kind of thing, right? Just the technical artistry of how he has a formula, a word from this parak, a word from that parak, using the alphabet. So on the bottom of page 154, the last paragraph, he works off a phrase in the fourth parak of Eicha. Lama ruach apeinu latevach shamaru. Why was the breath of our nostrils guarded for slaughter? So this is a pasuk. Comes from pasuk at the end of Eicha, fourth parak of Eicha. Ruach hapeinu Mashiach Hashem, the breath of our nostrils, the anointed of Hashem, Nilkad b'chizosam, was captured in their pits. Asher amarnu b'tzilo nichya v'goy. The one of whom we said, we will live among the nations under his shadow. So this is a lament for an anointed king of Israel. For his death. For Ruach Hapeinu, the breath of our nostrils. The one who gives us life. So if you look in the English here in the Art Scroll, it translates, this is a reference to King Josiah. Yoshio HaMelech. We've spoken about Yoshio many times on Tisha B'Av. Yoshio was the last great king, the last great hope of the Jewish people. And Rashi indeed says that the original pasuk is a reference to King Josiah, to Yoshio HaMelech. But I'm not sure that that's pshat. And neither was the Ibn Ezra. The Ibn Ezra says this is not a pasuk about Yoshio, at least not frontally. Yoshio had been dead for some time when Yerushalayim was destroyed. Says the Ibn Ezra, Zay nenu nachon. Not correct. Didn't pull punches, the Ibn Ezra. Hanochon be'enai, ki al tzidkiyo yidaber, v'u'aya ba'achrus hagolios. Says the Ibn Ezra, I think the pasuk is not about Yoshio, but about Yoshio's son, Tzidkiah. Because Tzidkiah was the last king of the Jewish people. And the truth is, the Rashbam says the same thing. And the truth is, he points out, Yoshio died in battle. Tzidkiah was captured. He was captured. That's what it says. He was escaping from Yerushalayim, and the Babylonians caught him. They killed his sons, and they blinded him. And they brought him into prison in Bavel. And the pasuk doesn't sound like it's talking about a king killed on a battlefield. The pasuk says, Nilkad b'shchisosam, captured in their pits. Sounds like Tzidkiah. So let's talk about Tzidkiah. When Yoshio died, arguably that was the end of independence. From that point on, the last years of the Jewish kingdom, the Jews were vassals essentially of one sort or another. And the kings, the last kings, were all children, grandchildren of Yoshio. Most of them ruled for a very short period of time. And they were installed by foreign powers. Because the backdrop of the story of the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, the Jews were a political football between the Babylonians in the northeast and the Egyptians to the southwest. So depending whose day it was, one or the other kingdom would install the kings. So right after Yoshio died, his son Yehoachaz reigns for 3 months. 3 months. And then Paro Necho, the Pharaoh of Egypt, shows up and arrests him. And he decides, I'm going to make your brother Eliakim, I'll make him the king. So this is the second son of Yoshio to reign, but he's not independently put into power. It's the Egyptians who put him there. And he renames him. Very interesting name. It's a very subtle difference. His name was Eliakim. Hashem will pick up. Which again, his father, his whole life was about picking up the Torah that had fallen, that had disappeared. Right? The Medrash says, when he found the lost Sefer Torah in the Beis HaMikdash, when Yoshio set off the last beautiful dreamlike state of the first temple, he read in Sefer Devarim, it says, cursed is the one who doesn't pick up this Torah. And the Medrash says, Yoshio said, Olai lahakim, it's on me to lift it up. That was Yoshio HaMelech. So he named his son Eliakim. So in comes Paro. And Paro says, we're going to call you the new king. We're going to call you Yehoiakim. Now this again, the idea that a king takes on a new name when he becomes king is cross-cultural. Right? You find this throughout history. Kings, popes, whatever. But the idea, Paro is not messing fundamentally with the beliefs of the Jewish people. He gives them a good Jewish name. He used to be Eliakim. Kill, God will pick you up. Now it's Yehoiakim, using Shem Hashem. You can play your games in your Beis HaMikdash. That's fine. I don't really care. Just remember, I'm the one who gives you a name. Yehoiakim reigns for 11 years. 11 years. Again, second son of Yoshio. And the Navi tells us he did terrible things. And he had a lot of tsaras. And now the Egyptians aren't in charge anymore. Now the Babylonians are in charge. And there's another king, a son, not of Yoshio now, but of Yoakim, the name of Yehoiachin or Yechanya. And he is not there very long, another 3 months. It says first. And he rebels against Bavel. And Nebuchadnezzar takes him out. And that's when the first exile, before the Beis HaMikdash is destroyed, the first Jews leave. They go to Bavel together with their king. Nebuchadnezzar appoints the last king of Judah, Tzidkiyahu. Ruach Hapeinu Mashiach Hashem. So what kind of king is Tzidkiyahu? So it's really unusual. If you read Tanakh, it sounds really bad. Vayas hara b'einei Hashem Elokav. He did what was evil in the sight of Hashem, your God. Those are the words you don't want on your tombstone. Vayas hara b'einei Hashem Elokav. That's what it says in the Yomim. In Sefer Malachim it says, Kachol asher asa Yoyakim. He did everything Yoyakim did. So it's fascinating. Chazal insist that Tzidkiyahu personally was a remarkably righteous person. The Gemara in Sanhedrin says that HaKadosh Baruch Hu wanted to destroy the entire world until he looked at Tzidkiyahu and he calmed down. That's tombstone material. The Gemara says, so why does it throw the book at him? Because he wasn't mocha. He never complained. He never protested. He never tried to stop what the people were doing. That the Nevi'im had been railing at all the crimes, the sins of the Jewish people. And Tzidkiyahu, even though, again, as far as God was concerned, he was a tremendous tzaddik, he was a righteous person, he was a fitting son of his father. It was interesting. Yoshio himself was Baal Shuvah. He grew up, his father was not just his father, the Zayda also. Ammon, Menashe, these are terrible, terrible people. That was the word when Yoshio became a child king. That was the world around him. It's interesting. Sometimes you see children of adult Baalei Tshuva, and you can see by their children how old they were when things changed in the household, right? What they were like. Tzidkiyahu was the third or the fourth of Yoshiahu's sons. He grew up, his adolescent years, was watching his father, the tzaddik, and imbibing that whole gestalt. But he, for whatever reason, didn't have that strength of leadership to be able to be mocha, to get up and try to say this is unacceptable. Ruach Hapeinu, Mashiach Hashem, Nilkad b'shchisosa. Nebuch. The truth is, there was one thing he tried. So I speak this morning in defense of Tzidkiyahu. That if the Ibn Ezra and the Rashbam are correct, when Yirmiyahu HaNavi was writing Sefer Eicha, he shed tears for Tzidkiyahu. So it behooves us to remember perhaps his finest moment. So Asar B'Teves, the 10th of Teves, is the day the siege of Jerusalem began under Nebuchadnezzar. That we learn as children in school. And that siege, from that siege till the destruction, was actually a year and a half. It didn't happen that Tisha B'Av, it happened the next Tisha B'Av. Because what people don't realize is there was a pause in the siege. There's a pause in the siege. Nebuchadnezzar and his army picked up stakes and left. So here's what happened. At some point, we don't know when for sure, but in the first couple of months of the siege, as the reality of the impending destruction was hovering, that's when Tzidkiyahu made his move. Tzidkiyahu summoned the Jews and made an announcement. The time has come for us to free our Jewish slaves. We need to free our Jewish slaves in the middle of the siege. And he says we have to free our Jewish slaves. That is going to be our national tshuva. Now, remember there's an institution that stalks Tanakh called debt slavery. Debt slavery, you think your credit card bills are bad. Debt slavery means your creditors have the right to come and take you as a slave to pay off your debt. Take you, take your children. The Nevi'im were very uncomfortable with this practice. And in general, uncomfortable with slavery. So Tzidkiyahu wants to find a schus. He wants there to be a merit to save the Jewish people. We know this feeling. Lo Aleinu, when they were stalked by a personal tragedy, someone has a terrible diagnosis. People make commitments, they take on all kinds of things. And we usually gravitate to the easy stuff. Saying Tehillim, baking challah. Tzidkiyahu says, we're going to do something that hits us in our pocketbooks. Something that shows God we're really serious about this tshuva. We're going to free our slaves. And the words I have to tell you, they're so beautiful. After Tzidkiyahu made a covenant, powerful words. Kores, priest, he makes a covenant with the Jews. To proclaim liberty to the Jews of Yerushalayim. L'shalach ish es avzo v'ish es shivchaso hoivri v'avriyo chofshim. That everyone should free their slaves, their servants, their maidservants. Levilti avod bam b'Yehudi achiu ish. That no one should rule over, oppress their brothers and their sisters. So Yirmiyahu describes, he summons everyone to the Beis HaMikdash, and they make a whole production, a whole formal ceremony. So you should know, we talk at the verb that we use for making a covenant. The word is kores. Right? Kores habris. Kores literally means to cut. And it seems in the ancient Near East, part of the way that you made an agreement right? Almost the same kind of idea. You talk about, making a blood oath, right? Where you merge the blood of two people. So you would cut something that symbolizes the two sides of the bris. That explains, the bris ben Abasarim, right? When Avram was commanded to chop up these animals for the original covenant between God and the Jewish people. That's bris milah, right? Bris milah is also a cutting. So Yirmiyahu describes they had this ceremony. They went to the Beis Hamikdash in besieged Jerusalem. They cut a calf in half, and they passed between the parts. Right? Echoes of Bris ben Absarim, the original covenant that God made with the Jewish people. Now they're doing it again to hold on to Eretz Yisrael, to assert the idea that Hakadosh Baruch Hu, look at us. We freed our slaves. We gave them liberty. Can't you do the same for us? That was Tzidkiyahu's most beautiful moment. And one imagines, you do the math, he was 10 years old when his father died. Yoshua HaMelech also brought the Jews to the Beis HaMikdash. He also made them go through a Krisas Bris. We find near the end of Malachim, Vayamod HaMelech al Amud, Vayichros HaBris of Hashem, Laleches achar Hashem, L'shmor mitzvosav, V'seirusav, Es chugosav, B'chol leiv, U'v'chol nefesh. Yoshi also made a covenant renewal ceremony in Yerushalayim, in the Beis HaMikdash. Tzidkiyahu reached into his father's heritage. He tried, and not only did he tried it with a hard mitzvah. It's amazing, the Gemara in Taanis tells us. The first Beis HaMikdash was destroyed by Mitzvah Shvius. It was the year after Shemitah. So again, I told you before, the siege started a year and a half before, which means the siege starts in the middle of the Shemitah year. And the Krisas Bris happens during the Shemitah year. So it's interesting, you read the Pesukim. The Pesukim tell us, your slaves work for you for 6 years, and the 7th year you free them. Now, the halacha is that means the slave, regardless of what year Shemitah it is, the slave works for 6 years, and year 7 he goes out. But it may well have been that there was a minhag, a custom, maybe of righteous people, that just like Yovel frees the slaves, that maybe it was considered a hanaga tova, proper conduct. That Shemitah, which after all is like a little Yovel, that people should free their slaves. Right? If you remember when we read from Yirmiyahu, what did Tzidkiyahu say? Dror, liberty. That's Yovel language. That's the pasuk on the Liberty Bell. Comes directly from Yovel. So I think it's not far-fetched to say that Shemitah had this Yovel resonance. And there's a striking Targum Yonasan, which often preserves old ideas and traditions. In the 22nd chapter of Shmos, it talks about someone who's sold into slavery because they can't pay back what they stole. And the Targum Yonasan says, he sold for the money that he sold. Va'ad shasa de shmitasa, until the year of Shemitah. Now, that's not the halacha. That's not what Chazal say the pasuk means. But the Targum Yonasan says black and white on Shana, Shaza, the Shemitasa, until the year of Shemitah. So in the last Shemitah of Malchus Yehuda, the kingdom of Judah, Tzidkiah made a macha. He took a step. He made a protest against injustice, against evil. And that was his shining moment. Now, unfortunately, the siege then breaks. Mazel tov! The siege is over. The Babylonians are going home. The Beis Hamikdash is saved. Crisis averted. What a yontif it must have been in Yerushalayim that night. Must have been like Matzi Yom Kippur. Avis Manedar, how wonderful, how beautiful. And then just like every Matzi Yom Kippur, what happens the next day? You go back to everything you said Vidoyan the day before. Right? Maybe if you're lucky, you make it to Sukkot. The Jews of Yerushalayim went back after their slaves. The slaves that they had freed. That's all over. So Yirmiyahu, in one of his signature unpopular moves, tells the people the Baalvim are coming back. And they're coming back because you violated your covenant. You violated the bris, the treaty you made with God. And you went and you took all those poor Nebuch freed slaves who were singing, free at last, thank God Almighty, free at last. Just joking. That's over. I saved your chains. Don't worry. I have all your chores ready for you to do. And Yirmiyahu said that sealed the deal. So first of all, it's a warning to us. About the power of commitments. It's interesting, there's a whole medrash, we talked about it a couple of years ago, that talks about the idea that Tzidkiah violated a vow that he made to Nebuchadnezzar. And again, without dwelling on what that medrash means, but it's the same theme. When you make a commitment, when you make a promise, when you do tshuva, you can't just do it, while the noose is around your neck. There will be an accounting for not keeping your word. I want to share one final thought about the bris of Tzidkiah, the failed covenant of Tzidkiah. And it's an insight that I saw from my teacher, Rabbi Yaakov Maidan. Maidan points out across the Mediterranean Sea, in those same years, 590 BCE, in a relatively unknown town, the backwaters of Yavan, Greece, it's a town called Athens. And in Athens in 590, there's a new ruler, and his name is Solon. Solon, they call him Solon the lawgiver. And Solon, when he became the ruler of Athens, made new rules. He canceled all the debts. And he said that here going forward, even if you fall, your creditors are in debt, an Athenian no longer is able to be taken as a slave just because he owes money. It was not popular, but it stuck. And this put Athens on a course to a leading role, not just in Greece, but in Western civilization for millennia to come. Essentially, Solon reinvented Shemitah. At the same time, the Klal Yisrael, who have the benefit of God's Torah, of its beautiful mitzvahs, of Nevi'im, who spent centuries yelling at them, they find themselves in mortal peril. They know the right thing to do. The just thing, the godly thing is to free our slaves. And they can't do it for more than a couple of months. And in Athens, just on the Seichel HaYoshar, just through the power of the mind, they realized, Taka, we got to do something here. Rabbi Dan says, is it possible in Shamayim, as they're weighing what's going to be in world history, the reason that at the time of Galus Rishon, at the time of the first exile, the Jews leave center stage of history. What could have been what Shlomo HaMelech built the Beis HaMikdash, the vision of the prophets, Kivesi, Beis Tefillah, Yikari L'chol Ha'amim. The Beis HaMikdash could have been a source of prayer for the entire world. Kimitzion Teitei Torah. That the Torah would radiate out from Zion and would change the world. That we got pushed out of line at that moment by the Greeks, who are going to change the face of history, who are going to bring down the Babylonian Persian Empire. We're going to change the world. Could it be because Tzidkiyahu's bris became a failure? And that we have had our complicated relationship with Yavon since that time, perhaps for that reason. And perhaps just to bring us back to our Kina for one moment. As I said, and you can read the words in the English and the translation, to look at how the Kalir not only references the death of Yoshio or perhaps Tzidkiyahu, but goes mamish back and forth in Jewish history. On page 152, at the beginning of the Kina, the Kalir says, Einim oleles bivanis nechuya. Literally, it says, my eye brings forth tears because we are crippled by quicksand. Crippled by quicksand. So the word Yavanis also means Greek. And again, I think the Art Scroll actually quotes it here. That perhaps he's making a reference to what we call Galus Yavan, to our struggles with the Greek world, with Greek civilization as well. So as we say the Skina, go down through the portals of memory, but also think about the idea of whether, even today, we live lives but share the values, the messages of the Torah with the whole world. Or if we're still stuck in the Tit HaYavanis, in a world still formed by the Greek quicksand that they merited when they seized the moment and we didn't. Page 152, Shav Asur. Shav Asur. Any moleles bivanis nechuyas. No mal eilani voichia. Apne peratz nu putzuv hasideh. Halgi suv zachra. Karo yisaru yisodeh. Al-Hartziyam Tzadu Shani Tzam Subinov Lamod Zidonai Tzakami Bimei Bandinai Tzadik Wadunai Atakan Nichvad Tominayam Kumi Avori Baseleri Moni Karasi Lamavai Hemarimu Lama ruchapeinu latevach shamaru raisi kichasanur ram chamaru avzok yad yicheskel in kanku. Zaken v'chor v'sula kavam ram habit na'amecha kulanu schar Adonai me'al yolanu. Okay, next Kina number 11 is on page 182. I'm sorry, the sheets are briefly out of order, so we'll come back to 11. We'll say Kina number 10. Eicha Yashvacha Tel Sasharon. This is the Kina which is based on the Mishmaros HaKahuna, the 24 families of the Kohanim. So it's interesting, we've spoken about this in the past, that in the centuries following the destruction of the second Beis HaMikdash, the memory of the families, the Kahuna, were cherished by Klal Yisrael. We've now found the ancient inscriptions in shuls in Eretz Yisrael and Yemen, that they have listed, right, in the decorations of the shul, the names of the families of the Kohanim. And there is evidence the family is kept alive. Right? Today, we're lucky, someone's a Kohen. What mishmar you come from, no one knows. Nobody remembers. Ancient history. But for almost 1,000 years, they remembered their names. They remembered this is where we come from. And it seems they were on the walls in shul because it was part of the tefillah. We'll come back to it maybe later today. I read it before. There's a tefillah we found in the Cairo Geniza where they announced this Shabbos, this family of Kohanim was supposed to be serving. And you can imagine, the father Cohen with his son, 700 years after Churban Bayis, is sitting in shul. And the father pointing, when they come into shul, to the wall and said, that's our mishpacha, that's our family. Sitting next to each other in shul when the chazan would announce, this week should be the Shabbos of Pilga, or Yariv, or whatever it was. Saying, Abba, Tati, this is our Shabbos. This should be the year, the week we're in the Beis HaMikdash. So I'll tell you a quick story about Kohanim of Bayis Sheni. About this idea of the power of preserving the names. There was a town in Eretz Binyamin, not far from where Yirmiyahu Hanavi grew up, called Gofna. Gofna. We think we know where Gofna is today. Fine. So in Gofna, Josephus, who himself was a Kohen, tells us that Gofna was a shelter for Kohanim during the time of the destruction of the Second Temple, run by the Romans. You hear this? The Romans announced that if there are Kohanim that want to save themselves, leave Yerushalayim, we are going to give you free passage to the city of Gofna. And you can live there unaffected. This is the nature of these kinds of empires. The Romans are butchering Jews outside of Yerushalayim and anywhere that they touch. But if you're a Kohen in Gofna, things will be okay. Of whom were the high priests, Yosef and Yeshua and their sons, 4 sons of Matisyahu. Again, these are very classic Kohen names in Bayis Sheni. Another son of the other Matisyahu. A lot of the family Kohen Megdolim. Caesar received these men very kindly, knowing they would not willingly live after the customs of other nations. These are from a Kohanim. They don't want to go to Rome. They don't want to live in a Greek city. He sent them to Gofna and told them that when he was gotten clear of the war, he would restore each of them to their possessions again. It's like a get out of jail free card. And in fact, the Romans paraded at some point the Kohanim that were living in Gofna in front of the walls of Yerushalayim, because the most extreme elements who were trying within the city were telling the people, all those Kohanim that left, the Romans killed them all. And the Romans wanted to prove, no, it's fine. And when they did this, Josephus writes, when Titus recalled these men from Gofna, he gave orders they should go around the wall and show themselves to the people, upon which he writes, a great many fled to the Romans. A lot of Kohanim died in Yerushalayim. If you are a Kohen alive today, you may well have been one of the Kohanim of Gofna. So we don't know what happened exactly right after the Churban. But there is an intriguing possibility that the Avodah, or elements of the Avodah, continued in the ruins of the Beis HaMikdash. The last Mishnah Eidios, Rabbi Yeshua ben Hanania, was one of the great leaders, one of the students of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Those of you who read the famous story about Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai being smuggled out of Yerushalayim during the siege. It was his two students, Rabbi Lezer and Rabbi Yeshua, who smuggled them out. So he was one of the Chachmei Yavneh, one of the sages who helped rebuild us. Says Rabbi Yeshua, Shamati, Shemakrivin, Afal Pi She'ein Bayis. He said, I have a tradition that one is allowed to bring korbanos even though there's no Beis HaMikdash. As long as you know where the Mizbeach is, you can bring korbanos without a physical Beis HaMikdash. All you need is an altar. V'ochlim kodshim kodshim, avo b'shein kaloyim. The korbanos that you have to eat in the Beis HaMikdash, you can eat without walls. Right? You can eat as long as you're in the right place. Kodshim kalim meiser shein al b'shein choma. And all the things you can only eat in Yerushalayim. Right? Kodshim kalim. You can eat without a wall. So what does he mean, Shamati? I heard this. So this apparently is how the Avodah first started at the beginning of the Second Temple. Right? It was a schlepped out process until they had the Beis HaMikdash up. But first they put up a Mizbeach and they started bringing korbanos. So when Yeshua says over this Mishnah, in the decades right after the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, was this halacha l'maisa or not? Were they allowed to bring korbanos after the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed? So we don't know. We don't know. The Netziv thinks they were. The Netziv writes in his Perush on Vayikra that at least the Korban Pesach, and he has very specific reasons for saying this. The Netziv says that the Korban Pesach was offered in those dark years after the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. After. So can you imagine this? The Netziv believes this is what happened. Jews slept in to the ruins of the Beis HaMikdash. Hadn't been plowed over yet. We'll get to that later. They knew where the Makam HaMizbeach was. They could see where the altar was. And again, it's not ancient history. These were Jews who had been there. They went, at least according to the Netziv, on an Erev Pesach, tripping over the ruins. You go to the foot of the Temple Mount today, right? You go to the end of the Kotel. You can see pieces of the devastation still in situ. And that's 2,000 years later. Imagine how much had been there. They went there and they tripped over it, right? And they're probably they're holding the sheep. Because, lo aleinu, the sheep, if it trips on the stones, it could get a mum. You wouldn't have a Korban Pesach. You can imagine these broken Jews bringing Korban Pesach in the ruins of the Beis HaMikdash. It's unbelievable. And they had to, it happens to be paskin this way. Right? We paskin la halacha, you're allowed to bring a korban on the arbayis if you know where the Mizbeach is. Now again, there are other reasons why we don't do this now. Right? You also have to know a lot of stuff about the Beis HaMikdash that we forgot. And you need proper Kohanim, which again, no offense to any Kohanim who are here. We don't know who's a Kohen today. But then they did. And they were probably the Kohanim that were hiding in Gofna, serving in a post-apocalyptic avoda in the Beis HaMikdash. You know what it must have been like for the Leviim to sing Hallel, where they're shechting a Korban Pesach in a ruined Beis HaMikdash. And the Mishnah says, Oichlem kodshim kalim, afal pi she'ein choma. You're allowed to eat the Korban Pesach in Yerushalayim, even though there was no wall. So imagine this. like the zombie apocalypse. Camped out in the shells of homes in Yerushalayim. The Jews might have gone back. That's during the years between the year 70 and the year 130. They might have gone back. They might have sat in the ruins. And they might have eaten the Korban Pesach offered by the Kahani Gofna. So the last afterthought. There's an interesting, complex debate in halacha. We know Kohanim are not allowed to come tummy, but there seems to have been a position that for a Nasi b'Yisrael, for a prince in Israel, a Kohen is allowed to become tummy. And we had, during the time of the Mishnah and the Gemara, there was an office of Nasi, of the spiritual, political leader of the Jews in Eretz Israel. That's when we talk about Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, right, the author of the Mishnah, he was a Nasi. So the Yerushalmi in Brachos talks about this business, that there was this idea you were supposed to be, even a Kohen was supposed to become Tamei to a Nasi. Kadamach Rabbi Yehuda when Yehuda Nasiya died, Ichriz Rabbi Yanai announced, Ein Kahunayom. There are no Kohanim today. Today, every Kohen should not hold them back from being at the Levaya of Yehuda Nasiya. Kadamach Rabbi Yehuda Nasiya, Bar Bereid Rabbi Yehuda Nasiya. Rabbi Yehuda Nasiya, the grandson of the famous Yehuda Nasi, died. So we're told Rav Chia bar Abba made sure that Reb Zera, people don't ever heard of Reb Zera. Reb Zera is a Kohen. He made sure that Reb Zera would become Tamei. And where did he do this? So he went up to him and shoved him into the coffin, maybe, right, to make sure that he wouldn't be too frum and not, in quotes, right, not become Tamei to the Nasi. And where did this thing take place? It took place in a shul in the Galil, in a city called Tzipori. Tzipori, some of you might have been to Tzipori, right? We think that's where the Kever Yehuda Nasi is. Very important city in the time of the Mishnah, the Gemara. The Yerushalmi says this was in Beknishta, the Gofna, to Tzipori. Right? In the Gofna shul in Tzipori. Vos made us. What's the Gofna shul in Tzipori? So Gofna was in Eretz Yehuda. And really, Eretz Yehuda, the land of Judea, Samaria, we call it today, after the Bar Kokhba revolt, which we'll talk about later, the Jews mostly left. So where did the Kohanim of Gofna, and there are other Gemaras that talk about the many, many Kohanim that lived in Gofna, and they lived there because Titus put them there. They had to go into Golus, into Galil. So they built themselves a shul, the Gofna shul in Tzipori, which is, this is what Jews do, right? When we move from one place to another, if you go down today to the Hill District, you can still ask Eric Litch, he can show you what they are, right? From this shtetl, from this geographic area, we make our new shul where we remember the old world. And that's really what this Kinos is about, right? And we're half remembered, not even remembered names of Mishmar Sakuna, the same names that were on the mosaics in the shuls that the Kalir sat down with to write a Kina, because you got to remember the names. It's a little bit funny. A friend of mine told me his nephew just got back from camp. And in his camp, they have intramural teams, right? Which is the classic camp thing. So this year, what did they name the intramural teams? They were named after yeshivas in Europe. Yeshivas in Europe that no longer exist. So it was the Slobodka Sea Lions, the Tells Tigers, the Volozhin Violins, the Radin Razorbacks. My son Yehuda on the spot said, not having the Meerkats was a major mistake. So it's a little bit funny. I don't know what they would have thought in Slobodka or Volozhin about the intramural teams in camp. But I think there's like an educational purpose to this. Like the idea that like we remember names. We don't. There's the Govna Shul in Sipori. And Govna was just there because the Kohanim of Yerushalayim ran there. But we remember Govna, we remember Tzipori, and remember Slobodka, and remember the Kehane Maron and Tzipora, and Isalo, and all the ones we're about to read in this piyut. And every time, this is the instinct of Klal Yisrael. We call ourselves Ashkenazim, even if our ancestors moved to Eastern Europe 500 years ago, weren't from Germany. No Sephardi has been in Sfarad in Spain in almost half a millennium. But we remember their loss. We remember what they stood for. And that's part of the memory hole of Tisha B'Av. Page 174, Eicha Yashva Chavatzon Sasharon. Eicha Yashva V'go mishmerosam kehanim ne'ahar kinimsar habayis b'nsar v'emarim. Tarchei chal shalom kinifratz koslam. Neiros menorah fast nilke da yavas achar azman shena asaf nishma yeshiva fatana samein lo v'lan of rosh sugu v'rav v'voktu kiyane ayelva chei chadam razeh of workena kuna Kfaruzi el tumasach nivasei Fanan avak raglovkov helvinisrak is karbel b'kohanei arbe yodu parasar b'deisavu kichaloyach yavti kidur hamapu kisoshus l'chibul v'nivul v'yitim kelavavu kay kol magay nakim lo l'morun ayin sofas v'chatz v'alcheres tipas v'chizkum sarova Veneras v'nilpas kayin tzefas. Nishkat ol ofon v'nichav ki hushavti anu nomi bliyo. Perisha hinyad sholeya.
V'sas many techina, v'lonosam lirachamim v'chanina. Mikirias chana, no klar yuchana. V'samriya v'chashchi tazriya.
Okay.
The next Kina channels Yirmiyahu Hanavi. By quoting Yirmiyahu, that Yirmiyahu is described as having recited a Kina, an elegy, a lament, at the death of Tzidkiyahu, of Yoshio. Eicha is called Sefer Kinos, the book of Kinos. There are Midrashim that say the fourth chapter of Eicha is actually the Kina that Yirmiyahu said for Yoshio, perhaps. What's interesting about Eicha is it's Yirmiyahu's personal statement. Right? Now again, it's an interesting question in general. What's the difference between Nevi'im and Ksuvim? Right? Did you ever think about this? We have two sections of Tanakh, Nevi'im and Ksuvim. What makes something, how are they sorted? And it's not a simple answer. Again, it's a topic for another time. But Chazal tell us that Yirmiyahu Hanavi has entries both in Nevi'im and Ksuvim. Right? In other words, he writes the book of Yirmiyahu. Those are his prophecies. And Eicha is in Ksuvim. So what makes it not Nevi'im? Right? What about Eicha? So again, a Navi can wear different hats. Right? In other words, a Navi can function as a Navi, right, as a conduit, right, for prophecy. And it can function as a Chacham, right? It can be a Talmid Chacham as well, right? The Rambam writes that many Nevi'im, right, were also part of the chain of Masorah. It doesn't mean they were saying Nevuah when they were giving over, the Masorah of what would eventually become, of Metziah, right? Then they were functioning as a Chacham. And there are other times they function as a Navi. So whatever Ksuvim exactly is, right, written Baruch HaKodesh, right, it means that there is more of Yirmiyahu the person, right, in Ksuvim than there is in Sefer Yirmiyahu. Right, again, all Nevuah is a topic for another time. Nevuah is an interface of a divine download, right, that's expressed through the human. And different Bali Machshava, talk about how different Nevi'im work. And the idea, ancient Nevi'im, Nesnab, Mesignon Echad, no two Nevi'im have the same style, right? Because it's filtered through the psyche, through the vocabulary, through the experience of the Navi, right? There's something else called Ruach HaKodesh, which I don't really have the language to explain what it is. It's a different level of inspiration where there's even more of the person involved. So Eicha is where Yirmiyahu gets to express his horror at his career. Yirmiyahu had really an awful job. And we have the very beginning of Yirmiyahu, we have his mission statement. God says, Re'eh, see, Hifkareticha hayom hazeh al hagoyim va'al hamamlochos. See that I have appointed you today, I've charged you, I've empowered you over nations and kingdoms. Lintosh ulintots, lahavid v'laharos, livnos v'lintoa. To uproot, to destroy, to decimate, and to build, and to plant. It sounds very much like the famous psukim in Koheles that tell us there's a time for everything. And for most of us, that's true. But Yirmiyahu did not want to be a Navi of destruction. Nobody wants to be a Navi of destruction. Yirmiyahu didn't want to be beaten. He didn't want to be thrown in pits. He didn't want to be put on trial for his life. He didn't want to be called a traitor, someone who was a sellout to the Babylonians, a leftist. None of this was anything Yirmiyahu was looking for. He was accused of not loving the Jewish people, of not loving Yerushalayim, of not loving the Beis HaMikdash. And Eicha is the chance where you get to see the inner roiling soul of Yirmiyahu. When Yoshiyahu dies, it became very clear to Yirmiyahu there's going to be very little planting and building that was going to be happening. He believed in Yoshiyahu, the last great hope of the Jewish people, a contemporary age. Yoshiyahu, the Gemara says, sent Yirmiyahu to go bring back the tribes from the north that had been exiled and forgotten. This is Mashiach time. Yoshiyahu certainly believed the redemption was at hand. Nebuch, like so many tzaddikim over the centuries. And maybe it could have been. Had the dream team of Yoshiyahu and Yirmiyahu been able to work together, if he hadn't died at a young age, who knows what it would have been. But when Yirmiyahu, as the Medrash described, was leaning over Yoshiyahu in his last moments, Yirmiyahu knew there was going to be very little. His dreams of building and planting wasn't going to happen. Vaikonen Yirmiyahu al Yoshiyahu. He's crying not just for Yoshiyahu, but he's crying over his dreams of what he could achieve. So ironically enough, when Yirmiyahu was a prisoner in Yerushalayim, not a prisoner of the Bavli, the prisoner of the Jews. The Jew said, this person is bad for morale. He's a traitor. He's a leftist. No good. And he was under arrest in a place called the Cheder HaMatara. And it was during the siege of Yerushalayim. And Hashem tells him, you're getting a guest in prison. Your cousin is coming to see you, Hananel ben Shalom. And Hananel ben Shalom is coming to see you. That there is a field, an ancestral field in your hometown of Anasos, that you are the Goel for, you are the Redeemer. We know there's a whole complex system in the Torah, the time of the first Beis HaMikdash, that fields belonged in families. You don't sell off the family fields, and in fact, there's a responsibility to have there's a whole hierarchy of relatives of who has the responsibility to redeem the field. And this, of course, is part of the plot line of the book of Rus. So Yirmiyah says his cousin is coming to tell him to purchase a family field. Now, the catch is, the family field is currently occupied by the Babylonian army. They are literally camped in Anasos. So there's a question on Mepharshim, like, what was Hanamel doing? And some of the Mepharshim actually say Hanamel was mocking Yirmiyahu. Mocking Yirmiyahu. Yeah, would you like to, I have a bridge to sell you in Brooklyn. Or I have a field to sell you in Anasos. But God had other plans. And God tells Yirmiyahu, do a whole formal sale with all of the minhagim in the day of how you write it with witnesses, weigh out the money, write out a document, right? Both the official copy of the document that's sealed away, right, for a long time. That's what I want you to do. So this strange presentation, right, happens in besieged Yerushalayim. It's interesting. I spoke last year, they about the plays that were put on in the Warsaw Ghetto and the Vilna Ghetto. It's a strange thing. Like, what do you do all day when you're in a ghetto or a besieged city? Right? So some of it's about food. We'll come back to food. But like, if you're still alive and you've had enough calories that you can still think, it's kind of boring. A lot of time doing nothing. So you can imagine, like, the word spread, they put up the signs like they do in Yerushalayim today, right? There's going to be this whole legal transaction, right, going on in the Cheder HaMatara, right? A Pidyon field, right? We know that there's, Pidyon Ben and Pidyon Petach Hamor, right? When these things happen, people want to come and gawk and see. So Masij Yerushalayim, they came to go see, like, what is this, right? And all the Bachrim who learned Bavakam and Bavbasra, right, and knew about buying fields, never actually saw it. And who's buying fields? Who's redeeming fields in besieged Yerushalayim? Came to see the show. And what's the show? Vatzaves Baruch Leineim Leimor. Yirmiyahu's Talmud, his shamus, his disciple, his successor, was Baruch ben Neriah. And he was his sofer. Right? He wrote down the Nevuos. So Baruch ben Neriah is writing down this whole thing. And Yirmiyahu says, I commanded Baruch ben Neriah in front of Kol HaYehudim HaYoshim B'Chatzar Matara, in front of all the Jews that were in this courtyard. I said, put away these documents, keep them safe in klicharas, in an earthenware jar. And those of you who've been in the Shir Shabbos after the last few weeks, and we talked about clay jars from the Judean desert that preserved documents literally for 2,000 years. That was cold storage. Laman Yamdu Yamim Rabim, God says these documents have to be there for a long time. Because so says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel. Od yikanu vatim v'sados uchramim ba'aretz hazos. The day will come when houses and fields and vineyards will once again be purchased in this land. That's livnos v'lintoa. That's to build and to plant. Yirmiyahu, you're not going to see it. But here, even in the worst place in the world, in your stinking cell in the Cheder HaMatara, with Bavlim outside the walls, drooling for what's inside, with Jews who are in denial of the divine message that Yirmiyahu is giving them, and the conditions that Yirmiyahu is being held in. And we hope those of you who were here earlier this year in this room to hear Eli Sharabi talk about captivity in Gaza, you only hope the Jews who kept Yirmiyahu in the Cheder HaMatara were kinder to him than the people who held L'Avdil Eli Sharabi in Gaza. But in that stinking place, God told Yirmiyahu a message of livnos v'lintoa, of building one day, and planting. On the day Yoshiyahu died, Yirmiyahu maybe gave up hope that he would ever be involved in the world of building and planting. But in the Cheder HaMatara, God gave him a gift. So we think, as we read the Kalir's reconstruction, inspired by the lost king of Yirmiyahu, we think about the difficult mission that he carried out, and difficult missions that God sometimes gives us as well. And our hope, our belief in our prayer, there is a time to destroy, a time to uproot, but there will be a time to plant and build as well. Page 182 by Konen Yirmiyahu Yoshio. Ben Shmona Shana Echel Lidrosh Me'Eloha Amro Malchi Yisrael Shekam Uligdor Lo Kam Kamo Mimos Avigdor Davak Bochet Leitzane Hato. Beat Samra Sabar Rasher Lo Yakim. And what say no give you no chatzim chetz achar chetz morim v'lo chatzim tzatu v'samog matara lachitzim v'yizrku bo shlosh me'os chitzim. Tam b'mikra echad kois megiddo l'shtos b'moed shnas hashmita. Kiko hakele asos tolo b'asr m'shtayim arsos shasos marosh shasos kisavadu lo eicha b'asr m'shtayim osios osos kinos lubata mecholi es ki shachachti mecholili zamosi kelaro yali roshadi v'nosati v'nuta shohali. Okay, we are going to skip ahead to Kina number 15, Eichash Baso. And I want to focus on one line. It's a strange line. On page 212. Ha'ochlim hektish Pesach b'leil shimurim, hechilon b'chofon roshei chamorim, hispiani v'amrurim. So this is a particularly evocative framing of a theme that the Medrash insists goes back to Eicha itself, which is the contrast of the highs and the lows of the Jewish experience, of Pesach, and particularly Pesach in the Beis HaMikdash in Yerushalayim, contrasted with the Churban. So the Kalir writes, those who would eat the sacred flesh of the Pesach offering on the guarded night, he fed donkey heads during famine. A very strange image. Some of the Farshim, this actually comes from an unrelated part of Tanakh. In Sefer Malachim, we are told of an earlier famine during the siege of Shomron. We're told the Jews, they were selling donkey heads for food. And the Mefarshim point out there that the head doesn't have a lot of meat on it. And this is, it's like the treifus, most disgusting, least meaty thing that you can imagine. So the Kalir plucks out this biblical image of a different siege as the contrast, right, to Jews observing Pesach. So I want to spend a couple of minutes, digging into these images. Alil Rega. It's hard for us to imagine what that experience of coming to Yerushalayim for Shlosh Regalim was like. Today, we have this maybe Bezer Anpin in a little tiny bit of a way. You go to the Kotel certain times. Slichus, Hoshana Rabbah in the morning, Shavuos in the morning, Yerushalayim. Ironically enough, Tisha B'Av. This idea of so many Jews pouring in. But what this was like, particularly in the time of the second Beis HaMikdash, in its last century, that unbelievably beautiful structure, where that sense of being in God's presence, of being with Klal Yisrael, of the physical beauty of what you're seeing, how all the architecture was designed to be able to create an experience. As you saw the Beis HaMikdash shining in front of you. And they came, they came from all over the world. It's interesting, there's an inscription found in Yerushalayim. It's a Greek inscription by apparently a Kohen by the name of Theodotos, the son of Vetinos. And it was written in Greek that this fellow Theodotos, a Jew, a Kohen, built a house, a place for Jews coming from the Hellenic Gauls, right? Jews whose first language was not Hebrew, was not Aramaic. They needed, it's like when we go to Yerushalayim and you look for the English signs. Theodotus put up a sign that we built this house for people to stay at and to eat at and to learn Torah in. Because Jews, Greek-speaking Jews from Alexandria, from Asia Minor, from Cyprus, even from Rome itself, which had a Jewish community going back already before the time of Julius Caesar. They came to Yerushalayim. There was a Jew in Alexandria. His name was Philo. It's an interesting fellow. Philo wrote, countless multitudes from countless cities come, some over land, some by sea, from the east and the west, from the north, from the south, at every feast. They take the temple as a haven and a refuge from the bustle and the great turmoil of life. There they seek to find calm weather and release from the cares whose yoke has been heavy upon them from their earliest years, to enjoy a brief breathing space in spaces of genial cheerfulness. We can't even imagine what this was about. And from all over Eretz Yisrael they came. Josephus tells us, on the first year of the war, the Romans were going to attack a city called Lud. Lud, we assume, is more or less right where the Lud that exists today, where the airport is. And Cestius Gallus, the Roman general, he marches on Lud, and nobody's there because no one told them it was Sukkot. And everyone went to Yerushalayim from Lud. And there was no train then. So it took a little bit. You're walking through the mountains on the roads. Nobody was home the first Sukkot of the war because everybody went to Yerushalayim. Tosfos tells us, it's Tosfos Basra. This is the whole point of Alila Regel, is to give us the opportunities to connect to Kedusha, to have those experiences, watching Kohanim Oskim Ba'avoda, watching the Kohanim at work, will cause the individual, when he goes home, l'chav and yoser l'yerushalayim v'lu Torah, to be able, in regular life, when there isn't a massive Beis Hamikdash in part of you, when there isn't a choir of Leviim, but those memories, those are going to shape your aspirations. Hopefully you go back after Yontif a changed person, an uplifted person. And the Meshech Chochmah says, the point of Aliyah L'Regel, Ishiyalu L'Regel, Liros Ponim Yizdabku El Aklal, is to feel connected to other Jews. Which again, we struggle so much with, and we know our ancestors struggled with also. But the idea that especially on Yontif, they had those moments, they felt zusammen, like we're all together. So the halacha was, you weren't allowed to rent out or to sell space in Yerushalayim for Yontif. You had to give it away for free. You had to give it away for free. You know, the Medrash says, no one ever said, Tsar li hamakom shalim b'Yerushalayim. Notwithstanding, no one ever said, I couldn't find a place to stay. It's interesting, the Rav Shrabbis, like Tzaddik Baruch said, the nace is not that everyone had a place to stay. The nace is that no one kvetched about it. No one said, Tsar li hamakom shalim b'Yerushalayim. Somehow they made it work. Because Yerushalayim is ours. Right? Every Jew is from Yerushalayim. So comes the night of Pesach. And we can't even imagine that experience. The Gemara says in Pesachim, Kazei Sepischa v'Halela Paka Igra. That it felt like the roofs were breaking from one small olive piece of the Korban Pesach and from the Song of Hallel. And Rashi explains the sound of Hallel at the Seder in Yerushalayim wasn't just the sound of your Seder. That after the Seder, you ate, you had to eat. It's a whole machlokas in the Gemara. But it seems we hold you have to eat the Korban Pesach on the ground floor. Why? It's a whole topic, not for Tishba. But after the Korban Pesach was eaten, they would go out in those cool Yerushalayim spring nights. They would sit on the roof and they would sing Hallel. And it wasn't just my Hallel. It wasn't just in my house. Roof to roof to roof to roof. If you go to the old city today, you can do this. You can walk from roof to roof to roof. Just have someone who knows where they're going with you. But like the sound was unbelievable. Ganz Klal Yisrael. And probably different tunes and different accents. But it's all the most amazing thing that you can imagine. So that's, that was the dream. And he contrasted with eating the heads of the donkeys. Famine food. Treif is the treif. Disgusting is the most disgusting. But never, you have to do what you can. Now, what we often miss. Josephus writes, the number of Jews who died in the siege of Yerushalayim by Sheni was an incredibly swelled number. Because the final siege, in other words, the last year of the war, when the Romans really closed in and closed off all the entrances to the siege of the city, they did it on Pesach. Just like the Nazis, knew which Yom Tovim you make deportations on. And just like Sinwar, Yamach Shmo V'Zichro, knew exactly when Simchas Torah was. So the Romans closed in on Pesach. Belel is Kaddish Chag. And Yerushalayim was filled to the brim with people who don't live there. So it's Pesach. And there's no getting out anymore. Right before, they were like, to and fro, but there was enough of a interregnum that Jews are able to come for Pesach and be trapped forever in Yerushalayim. And we know the storehouses of food were burned down. And on top of that, it's the very, very beginning of the harvest. There's very little food from last year. All the yashan has been eaten up, all the old grain. And so the people who came to eat the Korban Pesach and to sing on the roofs of Yerushalayim are eating the siege fare of the donkeys. Now, there's one little piece that we need to understand if we want to really appreciate what the Kalir is doing here, which is there was a terrible, there actually were many. The ancient world had a lot of fake news. And there were a lot of canards against the Jewish people. Some of which are still with us to this day. Right? This is when the blood libel begins. The blood libel, which again, you can go on your phone today and find people like Candace Owens 2,000 years later are still recycling the blood libel. So one of these, there was a fellow, an Egyptian anti-Semite by the name of Appian. So Appian writes, what did the Jews do in their secret chamber in the Beis HaMikdash? Right? This was like one of the dirty jokes of antiquity. Right? It was this idea that Jews have this secret room that no one goes into. So he writes, what do? They worship the head of a donkey. The head of a donkey, this is what Jews were. And this was material if you were a comic, an influencer, right? A broadcaster in ancient Greece, ancient Rome, and you went into your file of Jewish jokes. Right? What do I trot out? I'm doing a set on the Jews tonight. And we can find this. The Midrashim talk about this. My teacher, Dr. Louis Feldman, put out a book where he went through many of these things about what the ancient world thought about the Jews. Right? You can read the comedy routines. Right? This was prime material. All he had to say was donkey head. Right? Immediate laugh track. Right? He didn't have to have a chap. All he had to say was donkey head. So in one image, right, you got to pull all these things together. The night of Pesach, the highest night of Alila Regel, a night that made Yiddishkeit, the night that you were supposed to go home and, like Tosfos says, have more Yiras Shamayim, have a chush for learning. A night that, like the Meshech Chochmah says, you were supposed to feel bound to other Jews, part of that chorus of Hallel across the generations. The Pesach that trapped them in Yerushalayim and left them with nothing but the donkey heads, the foul food of famine, and the butt of the jokes of the ancient world. We'll continue with Kinos Tesvav, page 210, Eichash Basa. Eichash Basa, Basuach Kever. Roti Ba'afo Sifever. Ani HaGever. There's a Mektish Pesach. Chofan Roshei Chamorim, Asbieni V'Amerorim. Tzayim Chosach Hashivim. Someto Grim, so happy to respond to the Chakim. Shiveinu V'Reinu, Eile Achukim. Next Kinos Zechor saw Tsar Befinim. I was just anyone who is watching with small children may not want them in the room for the next presentation. Whether you want them there in general for these, as your parenting, but I'm giving you a heads up in advance. Zechor Asher Asa Tsar Befinim draws on the depiction in the Gemara of the Roman general, later Emperor Titus Arasha, as he enters the Beis Hamikdash and declares war on the God of Israel, defiles the Beis Hamikdash. And the most chilling image that we find in the Gemara is that Titus enters the Kodesh HaKadoshim, the Holy of Holies, right? We just mentioned, slashes the Baruchas with the sword, unfurls the Sefer Torah. We don't know. We talked in previous years about what happened to the Sefer Torah in the Beis Hamikdash. He takes the Sefer Torah, he unfurls it on the floor, and he consorts with a zona, with a prostitute in the Kodesh HaKadoshim, the ultimate defilement. Now, I'm sure I've shared this with you. I've been taken with an idea for a couple of years now. They found in a sefer on the Agados HaChurban, on the stories of the Churban Beis Hamikdash, written by Rav Benny Kalmanson, the Shiva in Otniel. We spoke at much greater length in the last few years about Rav Benny and his sons, his son Menachem, who wrote the Sefer with him, who went with Rav Benny's other son, Rav Elchanan, on Simchas Torah 2-3 years ago, went into one of the kibbutzim and went in under fire time and time again. The two of them saved 80 people on that day until Elchanan was killed by the terrorists of Hamas. So Rav Benny wrote a book about Churban Abayis. It's powerful, very well done sefer. So some of you might remember, I think I shared this last year, his son Menachem, the one who survived, was the hero who came out, spoke here in Squirrel Hill at Chabad at Altain Shul. So after, it was a beautiful, beautiful presentation. I talked about it, I think, at much greater length last year. I went up to Menachem, and I said, please tell your father that there are Jews in a city called Pittsburgh you maybe never have heard of, who on Tisha B'Av learn the Torah that your father taught in his Sefer. And he said, you should know it'll be very meaningful to my father to hear that. So once again, it should be a schus. The Kalmanson family should give no more korbanos. So he said, we know from the history that at the time of the siege of Yerushalayim, that Titus had a Jewish mistress. Her name, in English, we write Bernice. In Hebrew, we call it Berenike. Bernice sounds, you think it's like a Jewish woman from Long Island in like 1953. So Berenike. So Benny says that when the Gemara is talking about the Zona that he takes in, he's referring to Berenike. Berenike is a sister of Agrippa Samelech, King Agrippa, part of the Herodian dynasty. And she is sleeping with the enemy, quite literally. Until eventually, when Titus becomes emperor, it's no longer politic for him to have a Jewish mistress, and notwithstanding whatever promises he had made to her, it's over. So Benny says the Zona. Like, who's the Zona? Where's it? The Zona is Berenike. So you think about it. Another idea. This is a story. It's not just one story. It's a story in general about sexual violence as a weapon against the Jewish people. Which is, again, a story we don't like to talk about for obvious reasons. And again, was part of like what made the events of Simchas Torah 3 years ago so roiling, so painful. And then, of course, when the world decided, it never happened. You know what's interesting? Outside of our Masorah, Titus gets like a really like Josephus, like kids would say, glazes him. Yeah, Titus is a nice guy. He's not the monster that we know. One wonders what the videos that Titus would have released attacking how the Jews are war criminals, not welcome in Rome, what those would have sounded like. But we know the real Titus. Without all the PR, without all the makeup. The madman, the monster in the Beis HaMikdash. And grabbing with him, and he didn't have the cameras that the Hamas people had. Grabbing the Zona, perhaps Berenike, to take out his anger, his violence, his aggression on the Jewish people, on the Jewish God. But Yom Ha'im, Bizman Hazeh. As I said at the outset, memory, Jewish memory, moves back and forth. I want to read you a tshuva. Rabbi Ephraim Oshri. Ephraim Oshri was a Rav in Vilna, one of the few Rabbanim in Vilna who survived. And he wrote up his tshuvos. We have them here in the shul, 5 volumes. Shiloh's tshuvos min hamakim. They're also available online. As the Shilohs, he was asked both in the ghetto and in Kafr. The Shilohs he was asked in the ghetto, and the Shilohs he was asked right after the war. Shiloh. Immediately after liberation, I was asked the Shiloh that is relevant to many Jewish women who fell into ignominy, oppressed, by those wild beasts, the wild boars of the forest, the Germans, Yimach Shvam, who abused their bodies in their honor. This is the shot. Isha Achas, one young woman from a beautiful family, one of the Chosheva families in Kovna, came to Rav Oshri in tears. He said she was taken captive by the Germans. And besides being abused by them, they tattooed on her arm in German the word Zona Bishvil Chayole Hitler, a prostitute for the armies of Hitler, for the soldiers of Hitler. So after liberation, she's reunited with her wife, with her husband. And they want to rebuild their family. Have children. Because they lost their first children. We'll come back to that. When her husband saw this terrible tattoo, he was profoundly shaken. And she comes to the Rav and says, "What do I do? My husband, what do I do?" So he deals with the Shaila. He says, for a regular Jew, there's no Shaila whatsoever that they should reunite, build their family. He says, this shouldn't be an embarrassment. Al-Adrab, mitzvah lefarsem, es godol matan scharan sheyizku me'ashomea tza'akas avyonim. You should make it known in public, the unbelievable reward that the one who answers the poor and the oppressed and the abused will give Nebuch, these women. That he'll bind up their wounds, to bless them with all of the brachos that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has reserved for righteous women. And he said, it should be known that all these families should be reunited. That God forbid that any family should be broken up because of this. And he says, the tattoo should not be removed. It should be left there. That she should see it loka os kolonu boshes, not as a symbol of disgrace. El k'semel shel kavod gvura. Laharos shekol kedusha shmo yisborach. Haragnu kol hayom. V'doresh damim osam zachar. A reminder that all of her suffering was aimed at the creator of the world. Ksiva zir l'chvod lahen, l'kavod lahen, v'la'amenu. L'os olam. This is something. It should be an eternal sign, a witness of what was done to us, and it will not be forgotten. Page 226. Avoseinu Zara. Zayn atzay ayech nislanech vavay. Father, chitu b'sol lavas eish v'nefes eish. Mimarom shalach eish nafsheinu davan. Otik l'shar z'shamam ba'ani kani shayit. Matzah tishim v'shloshim klishares. Noshem. Kisharu kivaris kikarka b'aisna v'avet. Star and Lufos for it. Base Kodesh Kadoshim. Tzachana so Hishri. Zacharabaye. Sikva samnas nulumeshev mi bashan. Ubaskol nishma ura lama sishan. The next Kinoim Tochalna is, at least in my estimation, the most graphic of all the Kinos. Because it talks about, it draws heavily on the Midrashim that deal with hunger. So hunger is a word that we cavalierly abuse all the time. For the most part, we don't know what hunger is. Right? We think missing a meal is hunger. We think a tinus is hunger. We think 9 days without meat is hunger. We live in a blessed time where the vast majority of us know about food plenty. And the dehumanizing aspect of hunger, of being reminded that we are, everything we are is fueled by our caloric intake. And that without it, so much of our humanity gets stripped away. It's striking. So I was able to read a fascinating, long article about one of the great Gedolei Yisrael of the last century. His name is Yisrael Gustman. Some of you may have heard of him, known him, seen him. He's a Rav, a Ram Maggid Shir in Vilna before the war. After the war, came to New York. He had a yeshiva in New York, I think in Brooklyn. And eventually his last years were spent in Eretz Yisrael, where he built his yeshiva, wrote Svarim of Lamdas. And we know there are many, many stories of Rav Gustman. Rav Gustman was in Vilna, in the Vilna ghetto. He later escaped, lived with the partisans in the forest. Rav Gustman, people who knew him, many people tell him that Rav Gustman would tell the story that he literally killed a Nazi in the forests of Lithuania with his bare hands. And he told people, I was Mekayim with my body the mitzvah of Mechias Amalek. That I literally destroyed Amalek. So I'm going to show you a couple quick stories about Rav Gustman during the war. So Rav Gustman was very close to the great Reb Chaim Ozer. Chaim Ozer Grzensky was perhaps the Gadol Adar before the war. So Erev Rosh Hashanah of 1939, as the war is breaking out, has not come to Lithuania yet. Reb Chaim Ozer orders a small printing of a 10-year Jewish calendar. 10-year Jewish calendar. 1939 to 1949. And people thought this was very strange. And he explained the time is coming where you're going to need a luach like this. So they made 100 copies, right? And 100 copy run of Reb Chaim Ozer's luach. I don't know how many copies of the luach are extant. One of them I know is, and that was Rav Gustman's. He handed Rav Gustman this luach, and he said, "You're going to need this," and didn't explain it. And Rav Gustman carried this luach, which gave him the dates of all the Yom Tovim, in the ghetto, in hiding, in a non-Jewish farm, in the forest and with the partisans the whole time until he came there to Israel. Until the end of his life. He had this little luach, the luach of Reb Chaim Ozer with him. Reb Chaim Ozer dies. Still before things got too bad. He had, I think they say maybe one of the last regular levayas in Vilna. So Rav Gustman, in probably 1941, is in a labor camp. And he's able to come back into the ghetto. And in the ghetto, people are dying of starvation. And the labor camp at that point, they were still they still needed workers. So we heard that in the ghetto, that Chaim Ozer's widow was still alive in the ghetto. So he decided he wanted to feed her, but he didn't know how he was going to make this work. Because during the day, he was in the camp. And at night, right, there was a curfew. There's a curfew in the ghetto. And they would shoot anyone who was out in the ghetto. And Rav Gustman decided this is Pikuach Nefesh for Rebbetzin Grzensky, who was an old woman who couldn't do any work. She couldn't leave her house. So he figured out a way he was looking for her. And he sees an old lady laying on the floor in the ghetto. This was not an uncommon sight at that point. And he recognized, he was really shocked, that this was Rebbetzin Grzensky. Right? This was Reb Chaim Ozer's almana. So he had to do something. So he searched around, what could he find to bring her? And he found somewhere a shriveled up piece of carrot. A shriveled up piece of carrot. So of course, man chewed the carrot so that it would be soft enough for Rebbetzin Grzensky to be able to eat it. And fed her the pre-eaten carrot. And eventually this was enough to put recognition back in her eyes. And she recognized Rav Gustman and said, "You should know how much my husband held from you." Can you imagine? That's story number 2. Story number 3 takes place before the war. And it was summertime. And they went out. Chaim Ozer and Rav Gustman went strolling. He's much older. They went strolling a spazier in the forest of Lithuania. And I saw last year Pesach time. Someone was advertising a Pesach program in Lithuania, in the beautiful forests of Lithuania. And I remember I'm like thinking to myself, like for me, the forests of Lithuania are places like where Jews were shot. Right? Like that, this is not like a vacation spot. But it was like before the war, right? Like to go out, I imagine it's not so hot in a good summer. And they were strolling together in the forest, right? The Gadol Azor and the young Talmid Chacham. And they're talking and learning. And suddenly Reb Chaim Ozer takes a break. And apparently he was some kind of I don't know what you call it, an amateur botanist, a naturalist. Reb Chaim Ozer starts showing Rav Gustman the edible forest plants, right? Nuts, mushrooms, berries, these are good to eat, right? This one is, you should know this is poisonous. You should know, like, it happens to be mushrooms or wild mushrooms were a big part of the cuisine of a flavoring of the cuisine of Lithuanian Jews. Right? This is a well-known thing. In fact, that when Lithuanian Jews came to America, right, they were used to these wild, the wild forest mushrooms. It's like a thing. You went out in the summer to pick mushrooms. And like there was a complaint, the American mass-produced mushrooms were flavorless. Right? What kind of soup do you make with these, Amerikanische mushrooms? Right? So Chaim Ozer is taking him like it's the scouts. Right? And it's like, here's a mushroom, there's a berry, whatever it is. And the herich b'kach rabos. Chaim Ozer went on and on about this. So he says, I had no idea what he was doing. He says, when he was in the forest with the partisans, part of what kept him alive was eating the foods that Chaim Ozer showed him in the Lithuanian forest. He said, we were so thirsty sometimes in the forest that we had to we weren't able to talk until we squeezed out the mud to get a little bit of moisture to put into our mouths to be able to talk. That's the third story. One of the amazing, heartbreaking things that happened in the story of the hostages was that Israeli hospitals had to develop a whole protocol that really didn't exist before. And it's a protocol that actually went through a number of different iterations, starting from already they made plans in October of 2023. What do you do when you have people who have been, food deprived for, they thought, weeks or months, a couple of months maybe. How do you take care of them? How do you not get into? And there's very little literature on this. Right? They had to kind of write the book from scratch, right? Of the protocols of how do you introduce food, and that as they were dealing with people, as you remember the last couple of years, there were hostages that came out in November of 2023. I was still in Eretz Yisrael for a short trip when that happened. And there were the ones that came out, a year and a half later, the ones that came out Sukkot time this year, and they had to keep refining and learning Nebuch from experience of how physically, mentally, how do you deal with this? In particular, how do you deal with the hunger? Because you know what? What did they get? There were times, sometimes they got a quarter of a pita a day. A quarter of a pita. Sometimes for months and months on end. A spoonful of rice. Sometimes some beans or tahina. Right? But the nutrition, and even if there are enough calories to somehow get through a day, right? Nutritionally, right? You're talking about, terrible, terrible things. There's an article in the Jerusalem Post that talks about that when you're starving, how the body burns through the carbohydrate stores in the liver and the muscles. Then it burns up your fat and your protein. And the idea that the heavy toll remains, that your organs aren't able to do what you're going to do. Testimonies, the hostages said that they shivered from cold, even in sealed rooms, because of what happens to the muscle and bone mass, where the body begins to consume itself. That's what hunger means. That's what our ancestors suffered. That's what went on back then. So in the protocol of how to treat the remaining hostages, they worked very hard with the families to make sure to try to ensure as much as possible a reintegration into their lives. And one of the members of the team was the dietitian, right? Every returned hostage had a dietitian that instructed the families about preventing refeeding syndrome, who obtains a nutritional history, reviewed the lab studies, measured, determined the nutritional requirements, make an eating plan, adjusted according to the lab results and the GI responses. That's what they did to us. And they asked the families, on the one hand, think about what kind of food your loved one would want to eat when they come back. That's interesting. A number of returned hostages said they were not interested in having any pita at all. Right? Pita is, part of daily life for people living in Israel. But for so many hostages, it was so associated with the horrible conditions they were kept in, the things they experienced, the things they saw, that they swore off pita. Together with the Kalir on page 232, the Kinos talks about hunger and even the depredations of cannibalism that some of our ancestors were forced to. Him Zachal in the Nashim period. Allah Lailin, Tani Beneich, V'hu Chavui, Menutach Nesochem, Allah Lailin. Im disrafna sham kol osam hanefashos kikotzim kisuchim alolayli. V'ruach hakodesh lemula marim hoi al kol shchenei haroi Mashikra modim, beis asher asu lamodim. Im tochal no nashim piriyam mashmi. Haring we make the shadon koin v'navi lo mashmi. So, just want to go back for a moment. There's an image in this Kina, which is talks about the Jews who are hiding in caves, right, and reduced to cannibalism. So there are really many references that we find in the Chazal to a period of time where Jews were living in caves and tunnels and shelters, which happens in the aftermath of the Bar Kokhba rebellion, which we'll talk about perhaps later today if there's still time. And we actually have found some of these caves, right? There was a place called Nachal Chever, the Judean desert, near En Gedi, in the 60s, that a cave, there were actually two caves that were found that housed significant remains, including bodies of Jews who hid there, right, from the Romans, and who lived their lives, right? We had, a woman brought her ksuba with her. Right? Literally, it was, if I recall correctly, it was a Greek ksuba. It was written in Greek, but it was a ksuba, right? They went to, like, this is our new home. So it's fascinating. Well, without getting into the details, there's a Mishnah in Maseches Nida. It's a very technical kind of topic. Talks about the halach question being discussed in the Mishnah has to do with certain bedikos, certain kinds of internal checks that a woman would be required to make in order to confirm whether she's tamei or tahor at a time where she's expecting to bleed. So, and the question for certain kinds of what we call a bedika b'shas vesta, that if you did not do the appropriate check, right, that the assumption is that she is tamei. He says, so Rav Meir said, Im haisa b'machbe v'giya shas vesta v'lo badka harei zeu hi tahora. If a woman is in hiding and she didn't make the bedika, and we can assume that she is tahora, right? Even though normally we would assume that she's tamei. Why? He says, right? That we can make an assumption in that case, right? That that due to the conditions that she's in, the Mishnah specifically says due to fear, right? And there's that will take away the normal cycles that would normally affect her. That's what the Mishnah says. So it's fascinating. We have literally we have a Shulchan Aruch for living in caves, right? And again, we know that again, this is something that also came out in the post hostage release things, right? That this is like a real thing, especially when you throw the hunger on top of it, right? The cycles get disrupted. So I mention this for one reason. Rabbi Meir says this halacha about a woman in hiding. So the question is like, like practically, like who cares? Like, why is this relevant? The implication of Rabbi Meir's teaching here is that there were, and we know, by the way, from these caves, they found skeletons of women and children. As I said, they found the ksuba. So it's interesting. You know, we know there's halacha, right? That for a married couple to live together, that the woman has to know where her ksuba is, right? There's that basic protection, right, has to be there. The implication seems to be, right, that even in the caves in the desert, under perhaps starvation or near starvation conditions, the Jewish families, like what the Medrash says about the Jews in Mitzrayim, the families continued. The family life continued. There was the woman needed to know, am I tahor or tameh? That's an incredible kind of heroism. And you think, we often don't know when these midrashim were set over. Like all the stories that we tell Pesach time, right? The stories about, the Jewish men who wanted to give up, right? And Miriam tells off her father and says, what can he do? They're beautiful. And for us, they're like, these are Pesach stories. Right? It's about Pesach. Who knows how many doros these midrashim were what people needed to keep their lives going. Just take a minute to think about the heroism of these women, of these families. Okay. Last two kinos of the Kalir that I want to talk about, we'll call it of the original kinos. L'cha Hashem Hatzdaka. And that Hatei Elokai Oznecha are both taken directly from Sefer Daniel. Right? That these are both actually from the Tefillah of Daniel, at the end of the book of Daniel. Right? Daniel, and who Daniel was is really what we're going to talk about in a moment. Right? Daniel tells us goes through 3 weeks of fasting and prayer for the Jewish people, which the Torah writes that might be the earliest iteration of the idea of the 3 weeks. Right? It doesn't say anything that it was our 3 weeks, but the idea of spending 3 weeks in mourning for the Beis Hamikdash, right? The first 3 weeks Jew is Daniel Ish Chamudos. That's what the Torah says. So the Kalirs invited Daniel into our Kinos about these two phrases. L'cha Hashem Hatzdaka and Hatei Elokai Oznecha Shema. So Daniel is arguably the first and paradigmatic Golos Jew. So Daniel, remember I told you there was a wave of exiles before the Churban. Daniel is part of that group. Daniel is a young man. He's from an aristocratic family in Malchus Yehuda. And he is not sent to slave pits. He is drafted into the civil service of the Babylonian Empire. Right? Again, as I've said in other contexts, aristocracy is cross-cultural. And they said, we're not going to waste, right? We have these children born to the purple. We're not going to waste them. We're going to put them to the service of the empire. And that's what the book of Daniel is about. So Daniel is very recognizable to us. Daniel is a Jew who has to, in the Sefer, keep kosher in a treif environment. They give him, there's a whole rich diet, what they call the Pasba Gamelech, that they give these young men, Daniel and his friends. And Daniel has to say, give us vegetables, give us legumes. We don't eat your tree food. And he's successful. He's successful. And he becomes, apparently, this incredibly charismatic kind of person. And he becomes a counselor to kings and emperors. First the Babylonians, then the Persians. And for the most part, he's very successful. He's like us. Jews who succeed in Galus. And he learns how do you live a frum life in Galus. And Daniel's the first Jew described explicitly as davening 3 times a day. The book of Daniel says he had a chamber in his house, his private base medrash. He used to go and daven there. And he had windows facing Yerushalayim. And it's remarkable. I'm sure they talked about double loyalty. And there were other people who were out to get him. And the stories in Daniel tell us about all the attempts of his various kinds of enemies to get him. His friends were thrown in a fiery furnace. He was thrown into a pit of lions. But somehow he always winds up on top. It's interesting. And Daniel kind of lives a double life. I always say this, I have never lived in a non-Jewish context. It happens to me, that's the story of my life. I went to Jewish schools, then went into Jewish profession. The rhythms of my life are the rhythms, Shabbos, Yom Tov, for good or for ill. And I always I'm always trying to understand all of you who work out in the world, what that's all about, right? What that experience is like. And I talk to people, the idea that so many of you have these double lives. I don't mean a double life one of my kids this morning was reading a book about Maranos, and he was asking me about Maranos. So I don't mean literal Maranos or danger. But the idea that you have this whole life that the people around you don't know. Some of you remember someone who's part of the Chevra here for a few years, Dr. Yehuda Tuckman, who now lives in Eretz Yisrael in Rapid Shemesh. So Yehuda was the anesthesiologist when one of my kids, my son Yehuda, had surgery. Okay, so we were in the children's hospital. And in Children's Hospital, Yehuda went by Jay, right? And that was I think they call it his slave name was Jay, right? So he told us, one of the nurses said to him, Jay, this kid, Yehuda, such a weird name. Have you ever heard it before? Where? And I'm like that was his name. And he told me that, because he introduced me, this is my rabbi, he's very, very nice about it. And one of the nurses asked him, what are those strings on the rabbi's belt? Do you know what those are? It's so weird that he has strings on his belt. And then I said, this is Yehuda Tuckman, who gave a 15-week Shabbos afternoon series on Tchelis, right? Shir, Shabbos after Shabbos. Some of you might have even been at those shiurim, right? So here, here's a Talmud Chacham, a Ben Torah, right? Someone who, again, he'll be really upset if I say anymore, but there's someone who's living on the one hand a full Jewish life, and he has coworkers who don't have the faintest idea what his life is all about. That was Daniel. So Daniel is dealing with whatever it is you do in the Persian government. At the same time, he goes through this whole period of fasting and davening for the redemption of the Jewish people, and then he gets sick. Daniel, Nechlesi Yomim, I got sick for many days. Vakum, Ve'eses, Melech, Samelech. And then I got up and I did my work, right? And I'm not in some kind of a kollel somewhere, right? I work for the Persian government. I got to go to work, and I'm sick. from all of my fasting. And what as David says, Ki ein mi misari hamelech mevin bedavar, ki chazakti b'vneim laval yargishu bi. He said nobody understood what I was going through because I faked it in front of them. I faked it. And how many people, how many American Jews went to work on Isser Chag of Sukkot 3 years ago? And how many of their coworkers asked them, how was your little vacation? And they don't know what a normal Simchas Torah is like. I remember my brother once telling me, he took off work. It was, I think, a 3-day Yontif or Rosh Hashanah, and he came back. Like, oh, you must be so relaxed from your weekend. It's like, if you knew, right? 2 days, 10 hours a day standing in shul, and then a Shabbos, and then fasting for a day, right? Like, I wasn't on the beach. But how are they supposed to know? How are they supposed to know? That's Daniel's life. Daniel's a Golos Jew. But Daniel feels the loss of Yerushalayim. And he says over this unbelievable tefillah that he wants to be redeemed. The Jewish people needs to be redeemed. It's not easy to be a Jew working in Golos. The Gemara Sanhedrin asked the question, Daniel's friends, I mentioned before, thrown into a fiery furnace. So where was Daniel? Like, why wasn't, they refused to worship some kind of a statue that Nebuchadnezzar put up. There's all machlokas, what kind of statue it is. It's not our sugi right now. Where is Daniel? He says it can't be that Daniel, the Daniel, bowed to an idol. So he says, where did he go? Yochanan says he was on a mission for Nebuchadnezzar. That's why he wasn't there. So what was he doing? They sent him to Alexandria, which again is an anachronism. There was no Alexandria. It was only at the Alexander the Great. Sent him to Egypt. What was he sent to Egypt for? To buy chazer. To arrange a deal for pork. Because the pigs in Egypt, right, were known to be, if you were in chazer circles, right, there was nothing like the chazer from Egypt. It was unbelievable. So he says, don't they say that they didn't allow export, right? This was, in general, Egypt was a very controlling place in terms of its exports. So where it says, so what's Daniel doing? He was arranging to smuggle out little pigs that they wouldn't notice. So this is what it means to be a Jew in Galus. You're closing deals. On the one hand, right? You're davening 3 times a day. And you're making sure that you're getting kosher food. And you're davening for Yerushalayim. And when you can, you're intervening on behalf of your brothers and sisters. But you got to show up for work. And they don't know that you're sick to your stomach because it's Tisha B'Av. And what's work? Work is, I got to get some chazer in Egypt. Can you imagine just the smell of whatever it was, this place? That Daniel, Ish Chamudos, that Heilige Daniel is spending his time buying chazer in Egypt. So we come back to these two kinos. And these two kinos are taken from these two phrases from Daniel. L'cha Hashem hatzdaka v'lo nigos haponim. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you're right. Tziduk hadin. We accept the righteousness of the fate that has befallen us. But at the same time, Hatei Elokai oznecho shema. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, listen. Listen to our pain. Listen to our suffering. Listen to our tefillah. And bring the redemption. And this, by the way, the whole career of the prophet Yechezkel was those two lessons. If you learn Sefer Yechezkel, it's all about those two ideas. Number one, face up to the fact. Accept responsibility. Secondly, believe that God still chose you. Believe that your tefillah still matters. Believe there's going to be another Beis HaMikdash. Believe that this is not, that you have not been rejected. Somehow we got to do both. L'cha Hashem hatzdaka, and hatei Elokai oznecha u'shema. Page 240, we'll say these two kinos. L'cha Adonai hatzdaka. Page 240. Other than that, stuck up. Tell us the chos. The flats as minayat. I wanted to share just last thought about Daniel and his friends. Gemara Sanhedrin tells something very interesting. Talks about how difficult it was for Daniel and his friends. Amar Cham v'Chanina Melamed she'onzen es atzman min haschok min hasicha min hashena. That working as a Jew, working for these kinds of emperors, meant that you held yourself back from laughter, from conversation, and from sleep. Laughter, conversation, sleep. And they had to be able to control themselves when they needed to go to the bathroom. Because of the awe of a king. Now, what are those guys called in a palace in London with big fur hats? One more time? The beef eaters is another name, no? You know what I'm talking about. They have the guys who, we'll go with the beef eaters. Not for the 9 days, but, and the shtick is, right? Like you can't flap these guys, right? And there's what it means to be part of a royal, coterie is that you have to have complete control over yourself. So maybe that's what they meant. The Gemara means. I think there's something else here. It was the idea that, like, you can never relax, that you can never take your mask off, right? Now, there's the idea that, like, you might be the advisor to the king of Persia, to the emperor of Babylon, and when they have a bad dream, they want to ask you about it. But you can't just take a break to go to the bathroom, right? You can't let them out. You can't laugh at the wrong time. You can't nod off. You're always on guard. You're literally never at home, right? Because you're not this. You don't really. This is not the place, and the danger can come back at any moment. You find this when you read diaries of African slaves in the South. They talk about this, like this constant need to mask your emotions in front of the masters, right? And the idea that it takes like a psychological toll on you, right? Of never being able to be yourself, right? There's a halacha that if someone needs to go to the bathroom, you have to go to the bathroom. It's called Baal Tashakse, right? Because the idea is it takes a toll on a human being not to do that. And part of the reason, I wonder if people like to critique Israeli culture, that Israelis don't hold anything back, right? Anyone who spent 5 minutes in the airport in Israel knows what I'm talking about, right? And it's a different world. And I once thought, maybe 2,000 years of holding it in, right? Holding in your emotions, right? Of self-control in Golos, right? Maybe part of what people want naturally when they go home is to be able to just be yourself, right? It goes back, that comment of the Metzudas David, right? Daniel gets sick. Nobody's checking up on him. He's gotta do, he's gotta show up to work, right? Because in the end of the day, these are the people I'm working for. Okay. We are coming closer to Mincha time. All right, Mr. Hashem will never get to this, but if not, we'll save it for Misaki Vakula. We'll get to this next year. Right, yes, correct. It's such a nice piece, but all right, for another time. Page after page after page. All right, we'll do this. Next Kina on page 260. We're going to skip ahead to Kina number 23. Tells the story of the children or grandchildren of Rishmal Kohen Gadol who are taken as captives, right, to Rome, essentially as breeding stock, and the tragedy of two Roman slave owners who try to breed the brother and sister, the grandchildren from the finest family in Klal Yisrael, try to breed them. So the Paitan, the author of the Kina, makes an interesting reference. He talks about the beauty of these young people. He says that with features as of the young woman, as bright as the moon, right? Kalvana beziv, uvesoar kitzia v'yamima, right? That she is as beautiful as kitzia and yamima, right? So again, most of us, the Paitanim, were experts in Tanakh. We have to rack our brains to remember who Kitzia and Yemima were. Right? So Kitzia and Yemima are Eov's last set of daughters. So if you remember back to the book of Eov, the book of Eov is about a man, a tzaddik, a righteous man who lives the good life. Right? It seems like he is a wealthy, successful, has a beautiful family, and almost overnight, everything disappears. And his children are killed. He loses all his money. He's afflicted with boils. And most of the long book is a discussion about the nature of suffering and the mystery of suffering. And Eov is part of the traditional Tisha B'Av experience of the Jewish people. In many minhagim, Eov was once read on Tisha B'Av as well. Right? I think by the Teimanim, they still read Eov. A couple of years ago, I talked about the fact that it's clear that medieval Ashkenazim read Eov. And in fact, it's in some of the minhagim svarim. And in fact, there's a speculation that the Ashkenazi trup for the Yom Narayim, right, what we use today, our Shani Kippur, is based on the lost trup for Eov, right? I saw a whole thing by a musicologist a number of years ago. Again, I don't have the musical understanding to explain to you how this works, but that this was the trup that Ashkenazim historically used for Eov. So Eov is part of, and again, even I think in the Spanish Portuguese schools today, they read part of Eov on Tisha B'Av. Eov is part of Tisha B'Av. It's the very end of Eov. Everything is restored to him. All of his losses are fixed. Vashem Beirach es achers Eov miroshiso. Excuse me. Hashem blesses Eov more in the end than he had when he started. Fine. He had a small house, now he's a big house. He had 100 cows, now he's 1,000 cows. I get it. Vayilo Shiva Banim, Shivana Banim, Ushlosha Banos. He was given 7 sons and 3 daughters. V'shem ha'acha, v'yikra shem ha'acha Yemima, v'shem ha'shenis Kitzia, V'shem Ashlish is Karen Hafuch. 3 strange names, 2 of which are referenced here: Yemima, Ktzia, and Karen Hafuch. V'lo ayu noshim yavos kivnos Eov b'chol haaretz. There were no women more beautiful than Eov's daughters in the entire land, and don't think that they are just being praised as pretty faces. It says, "Vayitem l'maviyam nachla b'soch achem," and Eov gave these daughters inheritance together with these brothers. Wonderful, massive. That's the end of Eov. So how can it be? How can it be that it's been made good for Eov because he now has new children? Sorry about the old ones. It's how is this a satisfying conclusion to the Sefer? How is it possible to say that your new children, God forbid, are nechama for the old ones? This is a sheet in the Gemara. The Eov is all a parable. And if that's the case, fine. In other words, it's not actually saying that he has new and improved children. It's a way of expressing the idea that somehow God will make things right. I can hear that. But there's a fascinating Ramban. And the Ramban, it's we don't have time to go through the whole Ramban. It's an interesting Ramban. The Ramban rereads Eov and says that the children were never killed. It was all an illusion. The children were taken away and hidden from Eov, and the end of the Sefer are restored to him. Right? These are not new children. These are the original children. So the Ramban, and it's all question in Eov how he reads it to make this work. And again, the Ramban may also be making a theological argument about the nature of evil. Right? Is evil really an illusion? That's a whole complicated sugya in theology and in Kabbalah, not for now. But I think that we can look at the Ramban and also say that maybe you have to say this. Because if not, right, we are left with the idea that somebody can lose children and be given makeup children. How is that possible? How is that possible? And how can that be the message of Eov? How can it be the message? And again, how could it be? So we'll come back. But again, even the people who rebuilt families, who are chalishing to rebuild families. But did it replace the old ones? It's not possible. One of the greatest machloks among the Jewish people in the 20th century was the debate over German reparations, which literally almost caused the civil war in Israel. So in the early 1950s, the poverty in Israel was unbelievable. Unbelievable, right? You had the Yishuv lost 1% of its population, the War of Independence. And then they immediately absorbed huge numbers of Jews from all over the Arab world. Those were very, very difficult financial years for the state of Israel. And a lot of people left. A lot of people left in those years. And there was a Knesset committee called the Naftali Commission that came to the conclusion the only way we can pull this off economically is if we are able to negotiate and receive payment from the government of Germany. And David Ben-Gurion, who was the prime minister of the state of Israel, was the face of pushing for this. Like the idea, it's going to be incredibly difficult to be able to have a viable economy. Germany owes us. Germany owes us. So let's do it. This was incredibly controversial. In German, they call this, my German is non-existent, Wiedergutmachung, make good again. Can you imagine? Right? This is the early 1950s. Right? The crematoria hadn't cooled off yet. Right? This is not any kind of ancient history. Right? It's been less than a decade. And the Germans, like these are the same Germans. These are not the Einiglich. These are the same Germans. The first Israeli passports, right, said on the passports, not valid for Germany. Because that's what Jews felt about Germany then. So the face of the opposition in Israel, political opposition, was Menachem Begin. Well, again, Menachem Begin had lost his mother and his father and his brother during the Holocaust. And he was like kind of semi-retired at this point. His political party was definitely on the outs in Israel. But this issue brought him back. He appeared in public on January 5th, 1952, wearing a yarmulke, which he didn't normally wear, but he saw this as a fundamentally Jewish issue. He got up. It was a huge protest. His protesters were holding Sifrei Torah, saying there is no way that we are going to take blood money from the Germans. On January 7th, the government was going to vote on the issue of reparations. And Menachem Begin said, the most shameful event that has ever occurred in the history of our people is about to take place this evening. They are on the verge. At this bitter hour, we recall our hallowed fathers, our slaughtered mothers, our babies led by the millions that slaughtered the hands of the Satan, who emerged from the very bottom of hell to annihilate the remnant of our people. They are on the verge of signing an accord with Germany, and of saying, by definition, that Germany is a nation, not what it is, a pack of wolves whose fangs devoured and consumed our people. Even though that blood was spilled like water, it was not for naught. The blood, holy and sanctified, taught us to fight and led us into the enemy's battlefields. Thanks to that blood, that Ben-Gurion, the little tyrant and big maniac, became prime minister. When the police were called in, Menachem Begin said, Menachem Begin was almost killed on the Altalena. He said, when you fired your cannon at me, I gave the order not to shoot. Today I will give the order, yes, to shoot. The last moment, Menachem Begin turns to Ben-Gurion and he says, I'm not here as an adversary against an adversary. As adversaries, there is no chasm, there is no bridge. I'm turning to you in this final moment as a Jew, as the son of an orphan nation, as the son of a bereaved nation. Stop and don't do this. He lost the vote. Now, L'havdil, the same machlokas raged among Gedolei Yisrael at the time as well. Schechter writes that he heard the Rav publicly speak out on this issue. He says that it's awesome to do this. Number one, because the Germans are going to think that they've made kapara. They've atoned for their sins. And the Rav suggested that there is a din Amalek, that just like you're not allowed to take from the booty of Amalek, you're not allowed to take the money from the Germans. And we actually have the text of the speech. And it wasn't just Rav Soloveitchik. The meaning of the world, the Torah, Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky spoke in the name of Aaron Cutler. He said that we have voted, all of us, majority according to the Das of Aaron Cutler, who is opposed to any kind of discussion with Germany, even if it would secure a huge amount of reparations. And Rabbi Yaakov said Rabbi Aaron didn't believe the Germans were really going to pay. He said, we don't do this. The Satmarov, interestingly enough, was asked by individuals about reparations. Right? Many Jews received monthly checks from Germany for years. So Samarov was asked, can we take reparations checks from the Germans? So Samarov said, Ein daiti nocha b'zeh. I am very uncomfortable with this. And he said there were people that didn't ask me the shaila because they knew I was uncomfortable with it, just went ahead and did it. He says, Avabichein lo ra'isi limchos b'makabim ki yisfaros l'kan l'kan. The Samarov said, the truth is, if you wanted to take, I'm not going to say anything. And the Samarov was not embarrassed to express his opinions when necessary. He says, Iyavshar laharich b'zeh b'ksav. He says, it's impossible to write about this. He says, he said, it's very hard to make an answer on this. Because who knows how many people were able to rebuild their lives with that money? Right? How many people? How much of the ability of the infrastructure of the state of Israel was that money? But then, at the same time, how do you take it? How is it possible to take it? There was a Jew who came to America, a very chashuv Jew, Rav Michael Dov Weissmandel. Right? He was involved, tremendous activities saving Jews in Europe during the war. He came over, he rebuilt his yeshiva in Mount Kisco. Rav Weissmandel saw reparations as the greatest betrayal of the Jews who were killed. He wrote one of the first Kinos for the Holocaust. And in the Kina, he goes on and on about the reparations. He says, Uvedin ben Yosem, Yerusha Lokach, and like the halacha of an orphan, he took inheritance. Miyad Am Rotzcho, Kesef Kofer, from the hand of the nation that murdered him. Blood money, guilt money. And by doing so, he transformed his heritage into ash. I'm really happy not to answer these kinds of shilas. Right? These are the after Tisha B'Av questions. Schechter wrote that he didn't hear it himself, he heard it from someone else, that years later the Rav retracted. The Rav said, I was wrong. I know he's fiery on this issue. I was wrong. He said, without that money, lo hayam dina yechola his paseach. The state could never have gotten off the ground without that money. And what's interesting is that Menachem Begin's son, Benny Begin, told Daniel Gordis, who wrote a really wonderful biography of Menachem Begin, he said, I think you were really hard on the reparations issue. He said, my father was part of the opposition. He didn't have to feed and put a roof over anyone. And Ben Gurion did. What was he supposed to do? I don't know. How could Eov replace his family? Maybe the Ramban is correct. Maybe they were just hiding. Maybe it's impossible to say that he could be paid back in that way for such a loss. We think about the individual tragedies of Tisha B'Av throughout the generations. And the idea that there is going to be nechama, that somehow HaKadosh Baruch Hu has within him, in some way that we don't understand, a way of repairing, of making good for these losses. I'll say the kina quickly for the children of the family of Rabbi Shmuel Kohen Gadol. Kina number 23. Eis nishmuvin avlu shnei adoinehim. Zem reshivi asiyainim. Shavisi shevcha levushas shonim. Okay, we will go to Kina Lamed Aleph 31 on page 304, which is the contrast of our leaving Mitzrayim and leaving Yerushalayim, which again, you can go back to the ideas that we developed earlier about this is just another version of the Seder night versus eating the head of the donkey. Page 304. Eishtukot b'kirbi v'alosei al libi tzeisei mitzrayim kinei ma'ira leman askira v'tzeisei miYerushalayim az yashir Moshe shir lo yinoshe v'tzeisei mitzrayim konein Yirmiyahu v'noin Iyah tzeisei miYerushalayim V'sis Kanan v'shachananan Tzeisim Mitzrayim v'chamas el shachino alayganon teisim Yerushalayim galeyom ramu kachol ma'akam v'teisim Mitzrayim l'dainim shatafu v'aurei shitza v'teisim Yerushalayim v'gan shamayim mitzor yazufu mayim v'teisim Mitzrayim l'another rorim mayim amor teisim Yerushalayim Ashkem v'aretz tuos ha'chorev v'teisim Mitzrayim kairei aleiva al naros bavel v'teisim Yerushalayim u'marei kol Adonai keishochal l'sfanai v'teisim Mitzrayim v'charav l'tu shal l'tavach l'tu v'teisim Yerushalayim zevach u'mincha v'shemen ha'mishcha v'teisim Mitzrayim skulas al l'kucha k'tam l'tivcha v'teisim Yerushalayim chagim v'shabbosos mofsim v'osos v'teisim Mitzrayim deine zeva v'teisim Yerushalayim tavu ohalim l'arbat digalim v'teisim Mitzrayim ve'ali yishme'elu machnos hareilim v'teisim Yerushalayim yovelu shmita v'eretz shokita v'teisim Mitzrayim Machar litzmisus v'charus v'chas teisim Yerushalayim kaparis v'aron avnei zikaron Mitzrayim avnei akela uchlei abol teisim Yerushalayim Levi v'aharonim v'shivim zikenim v'teisim Mitzrayim Nozim amonim mochrim v'kainim v'teisim Yerushalayim Moshe Yeran v'Aaron yenachena v'teisav Tzayin v'uchanet aradrianos keisa teisim Yerushalayim Naruch melchama v'Adonai shama teisim Mitzrayim rachak miman hinay teisim Yerushalayim Tisrei parochas Tisrei ma'arechas teisim Mitzrayim Heimanit Allah Yisachachas v'teisim Yerushalayim Allah Yisachem v'yishein yochim v'charem u'karim v'tzion ha'yikarim v'teisim Yerushalayim v'reim nikbos l'chavod nikbos v'teisim Mitzrayim srikas v'sruah alos v'zlav v'teisim Yerushalayim tzitz hazav am shel v'rav v'teisim Mitzrayim u'shlach hanezer v'fet ha'ezer v'teisim Yerushalayim kusha u'nevuah chod Adonai nira v'teisim Mitzrayim nigala mara rachatom v'teisim Yerushalayim Rina v'shua v'chatotos hatrua teisim Mitzrayim zakas oila v'nakas chala v'teisim Yerushalayim shulchan u'mnara v'chalil k'torah teisim Mitzrayim elo v'sayei v'vasal matzei v'v'tei Yerushalayim tzaro seuda u'chlei achemda v'teisim Mitzrayim Sasan v'simcha v'nas yagai lana v'shuvi l'Yerushalayim. Okay, we are nearly out of time. So we'll take a moment. Again, we have spoken a number of times this morning, come back to the experience of choosing the Holocaust. And what has become, I think, the dominant minhag among Ashkenazim today is to say at least one kina specifically for the Holocaust. Before Litzion, we'll take a moment, page 384, to say the kina by the Bava Rebbe, Zichruna, page 384. Zichruna, the canonical Yisrael, Kolachem Yishama B'Rama, Kishmida Germania, Esameinu, B'mizama Milchama, B'misas Mishunas Achzarios, B'Rav, V'Tzama, Al Tishkechu B'Chol HaDoros, Adeitis Kuliros V'Nechama, Tzaka Sam V'Chiosam, Tzufim V'Skurim Kronim, Katzon L'Tevach Yuval, L'Serva Giv Shonim, Kol Shavam, Yizacher Tamid, L'Vnei Shochein Monim, B'Karim Shema Yisrael, Masr Nafshan Adonai Adonim, Rosh Yeshiva Samidei, Amcha Shama, Heavy Dominion Kashim, Barak B'Yadram, Demei Yiladim Rakim, Zvakim Elecha, Min Adama Nikam Nikmas, Tavnoshim Los Chayegel Nishama, Sreifas, Alfei Midrashos, Technesios, Rivers of Retirable Amdel, Nikonain Bishios, Shilchuish Makadashel, Itzizvein Sophios, Yishalem, Avirus Abeiro, Yodim Agoyim Alegivios, Akushamayim Adama, Alfei Aros Mitzere Sora, Arsos Yormakilo Seo, No Chaleim Kaim Misora. Tzadikim Skin V'Chasidin V'Kemunat Torah Miyam Willing Me'artzeinu Lo Haya Kozek Kilayono Ro Rachem Al Sheriseinu Habedna Me'Shamayim Lachanos HaKdoshim Ki Aser Ki Yotzei Mitzrayim Kovamis Kodshem Nachamim Kivlayim Romameinu Aviyeinu L'Tzion V'Yerushalayim. On page 390, we will rise for Litzion. Litzion v'yorecha, ma'wisha l'tzirecha, v'chivsu lo ha'gurasa, Abal Neureo, Eyanon Asher Yutar, V'yash Masor Adoreo, V'yal V'yas Necharfeo, Som Mikdash Chadoreo, Alei Golus V'shar Seir, Mani Meishir Zimoreo, V'yadamam Asher Shumayim V'nayyoyeo Aleyam V'aleo Asher damam V'yoreo V'yadam Asher Shomeim V'ito Sanhedreo Aleis V'altefei Semideo V'chilyanei V'toireo V'yachilung Eleino, U'mizvach Yetoireo, Alei Tavei Melocheo, Sh'nei Dovid Gevireo, V'yal Yom Yom Asher Locha, V'yisoru Kisoreo, Alei Koloy Asher Golo, V'yeis Korban Nevireo, V'yalochetz Asher Lochak, Sam Sakim Chagureo, Alei Nachas V'rel Mako, Asher Hukun Nizireo, V'yal Nibutz Alei Selah, Olo Leho Noreo, Alei Simchas Oyveo, Sochagus Moshoreo, V'yalinui B'nei Chorim, Nitiv V'hot Ze'oreo, Alei Keshat Sheriso, Zilot Arad Ashureo,
V'al tzimos ge'olo, shezuveho shechoreo, alei kolos mecharfeo, v'yeis rabu v'goreo, v'al mikshas megadfeo, v'zoyif mishkan chatzereo, alei shimcho asher chulav, v'fi komei metzireo, v'yal zavulo, kisho u'shma moreo, v'tzion v'yoreo, v'risha betzireo, v'chipsu lo v'agulasak, Page 396. Trachem Zion Kasher Marta. Fadnel Kasher Didarta. Tmahir Yeshua. V'safish Kula. V'sashuf Yerushalayim. V'rachamim Radim. Kakos Ulayad V'yechon Lofein. Ko Amar Adonai. Shavti Yerushalayim. Rachamim. Beisi Yibane Banu Adonai Tzos. V'kali Natel Yerushalayim. V'nemar Kolimor. Ko Amar Adonai Tzos. Ot futzerare amarai mito, v'nicham Adonai odes Tzion, u'vachar al Yerushalayim v'nemar, ki nicham Adonai Tzion, nicham v'char v'sah, v'yosef v'baruch keidan l'arbasa, ki gan Adonai, sason v'simcha yimatzei v'todo, v'kol zimra, Asher Yisrael. Asher Shkachlo, Asher Shkachlo. Tilo, it's all together. Okay, now left off our question.
Also, later be the direct associate with judgment and not the direct on the entire law. You don't think